Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
1. The thumping inside my chest pounded in a rapid cadence, not skipping a beat. I swear it felt harder and deeper with every slide of my knee drug across the rough and aging concrete encasement. Both sides of the ledge were separated by the iron half-pipe nestled tightly into the concrete bridgework my butt sat perched upon. As each knee scooted forward, it was mere inches from spilling over the side into the abyss below. I had gone too far. I couldn't make myself turn around. My body refused to back up to where I'd climbed on to start my journey. There was no looking down now that I'd passed the rocky bluff the pipe bridge jutted out from. I knew I had to continue to the other side of the deep hollow canyon leading past the river below, the deep waters of the Petit Jean. I remember the first time I saw the pipe bridge. I wondered what could possibly be carried within the iron pipe that crossed over the river. My best friend Charlie led the way as we carefully scooted across the long passage, small increments with each movement of our knees followed by a butt scoot across the pipe. He told me about the hidden place we could sanction as our secret hideaway fort, just the other side of the river, secluded from sight inside an area surrounded by a forest of strange white-barked, twisted trees. Charlie told me about the ground underneath the canopy of tree branches covered in magic moss-like carpet that felt cool and squishy on one's bare feet. He called the place enchanted and told me no one in the world knew of its existence except him. I was only 7 years old, he having recently turned 8. I believed every word he spoke as if it were gospel. When we finally did cross to the other side and climb down the rocky bluff, we entered a hidden path into that magical forest, and I realized he had indeed told me the truth. It was beautiful. It was bright green, both serene and eerie as the wind whistled whimsical tunes through the tree limbs and swept through the fragrant space enclosed within. While I dreaded the trip back across the water-filled canyon, I knew I'd be making the pipe bridge crawl many times throughout my childhood years. I knew my parents would ban me from such activity if I ever told them. I also knew Charlie would never forgive me for giving our spot away to anyone from the outside. The first trip back across that afternoon was almost worse than the first passage coming over. This time I took a chance by moving my focus from looking at the half-pipe leading my way and instead down to each side of the danger leering below. It felt like hundreds of feet. No, thousands of feet below to the river water and rocks. Looking back now, I realize it was more likely only 20 or 30 feet, but still enough to kill a 7-year-old if he fell into its vastness. It wasn't the part of this pilgrimage traversing above the water of the river that scared me the most. It was the small rocky island sitting almost halfway between the world of Charlie's secret magical place we were leaving and the entrance into our parents' world filled with their protection. I knew those jagged rocks below were deadly. I also noticed the dark crevasse that sat dead center of the island, the black trench Charlie called Hell's Gate. At only 7, I held no clue how my friend knew such things, but he had proven his honesty about his secret place with his descriptions matching what I saw exactly. I knew I didn't want or need to question his knowledge about Hell's Gate. I wanted no part of that. I only knew from that day on I was most scared during each crossing when I slowly slid precariously over the dark thick hole between the large jagged rocks. I always took my time and slowly maneuvered each rough-skinned knee along the concrete rough edge, which quickly forced the thick calluses on my kneecaps, replacing the once thin soft skin residing there before. 2. My story could probably end with those childhood memories of my growing up and spending every single summer day with my best friend Charlie Wallace in our tiny little town of Pontoon, Arkansas, near the Petit Jean River in Conway County, if not for one important detail. Becky Shea Cahill, the new move-in from a faraway place called California. Well now, Rowdy, this is an interesting addition to your story. I don't believe you've ever mentioned a girl before, have you? No, Doc, I've not mentioned her before. She was a real beauty of a young girl, but a truly dark spot within the story. What are the rules of you being able to repeat any of the things I tell you? Protected? Rowdy questioned. That's a great question, Rowdy. The notes I have containing our conversations are strictly confidential. A court could possibly use a warrant to obtain them, but I write very scant notes for just that reason. I consider our conversations as treatment to aid in your mental health recovery and have no intent on ever sharing such information with anyone, not family nor law enforcement. I suppose you will have to put your faith in my word that I believe enough in my profession that I will keep that promise to you. Rowdy, your mental health is my priority. Do you trust me when I tell you this? I do, Doc. I know I need help. I feel a deep pounding thunder inside my heart, just about as booming as that day I turned 9. A little less rapid, of course, most likely because of my age now. I'm 58, you know? But my blood still pumps through these tired old veins in such a way it fills my body with crippling anxiety and fear. Rowdy's eyes became fixed. His face and ears began to redden. I suppose I've got no choice other than let the pressure build till I blow a gasket and it ceases my heart and brain up. But that wouldn't help me or Becky now, would it? So, I'll just say you are an honest doctor who will help me kill this demon inside my head. No, Rowdy, your heart or head seizing up would not help anyone. I'm glad we now have this trust between us. I think we can make major breakthroughs in your condition if we proceed such as we have already. I'm ready to tell you everything, Doc. I can't go on any longer this way. It's been far too long already. You're my last patient for the day. How about we just skip paying any attention to the clock this session and just keep going until it feels right stopping? Is that okay with you? Double time? You know my finances, surely. Let's not worry about the cost. Let's get the heart rate of yours slowed down to a manageable speed, Rowdy. Well, okay, Doc. 3. Becky Shea was my first and only crush, Doc. In fact, after all this time, I think it must have been true love. I still remember how her blonde curls in her hair caught my attention the first time she was escorted into Mrs. Rice's second-grade class I attended. Principal Reaney opened the door and introduced her to my teacher, and I swear I heard the clatter of melodic wind chimes throughout the classroom. I knew I felt something I'd never felt before, and I was instantly drawn into its clutches. It felt like a magic spell had been cast upon my heart. So it's been, a couple of years now at this point since you'd started crossing the pipe bridge to your and Charlie's spot? Yeah, it was almost old hat making the crossing there and back by this time. Memory muscle, really. I could do it with my eyes shut, or I could watch the world below it. The cliff, the water, the island, even Hell's Gate. Rowdy spoke with a calmness in his voice. If only things had stopped there at that point. That old adage, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Doc guffawed as if he had understood regret. That's right, Doc. You see, though, I'm sure that things didn't just end there. The tone changed in Rowdy's voice. It tightened and became curt. I should never have suggested to Becky Shea that she come with me. Never. Rowdy's breathing became elevated in volume, and the sound of painful sighs escaped his lips as he exhaled. Do we need to stop a minute? I can pour you a Coke or a cup of coffee, ice water? No, Doc. I just need to power through it, I think. Well, take a breather anytime you need to. There's no ticking of the time clock this evening. I'm here to see if we can get this out of your head once and for all. I appreciate that. I'm just glad you haven't wanted to just sedate me with meds like all the other doctors have. I won't say that medicines don't have their place. I just think we need to see if we can bypass them as long as we can and heal with understanding the whys we sometimes suffer from our experiences and let them rule us. Those words alone are a godsend, Doc. We're building trust between us, Rowdy. That's the first step in solving these problems. Trust. Well, Doc, like I was saying, I shouldn't have invited Becky Shea, but I did. Rowdy's calmness began to sink back into an obvious tightness. I thought Charlie would be okay with me bringing her across the bridge. I never even thought to ask him. He liked Becky Shea too, or at least he seemed to. The three of us would sit together at lunch most of the time. Hell, she even liked to play softball with us out on the playground after lunch and during recess. She really wasn't a girly girl, more like a tomboy, really. Rowdy seemed to travel back in time within his mind, pausing briefly for reflection before continuing his story. There was one aspect I never even thought of about our little triangle friendship, one Charlie never told me or hinted at to me. Rowdy guffawed quietly as if he had just received an epiphany. Doc, I'll be damned if Charlie didn't have the same feelings of puppy love for Becky Shea as I did. He never told me, but the look on his face when he saw her walking beside me through the tight opening and cover between the tree limbs. He stopped again and then looked straight into Doc's eyes. I saw red in Charlie's eyes. He was jealous as could be. Rowdy, what was her experience exhibiting as you both made the trek across the pipe bridge? Fear like you felt your first time? She was like an old pro, Doc. Never cried out or asked me to slow down or stop. In fact, she said the river looked beautiful from up above, like staring down from heaven at a slice of God's gift, if I remember correctly. Rowdy smiled warmly before continuing. She was the perfect girl, Doc. Beauty, smarts, brave as a charging bull, but being around her felt relaxing as a warm bath. Do you know what I mean? I think I do, Rowdy. You've been very descriptive in all your story. You have an uncanny ability to paint the picture so vividly. I feel like I was one of your friends who was there with you, living in your childhood as a good friend. Yeah, Doc, that's funny you say because I feel the same way. Ready for a Coke or a coffee break yet? No, I think I'm fine. All right, so Charlie didn't seem happy to see you two? At first I couldn't tell by just his eyes. It was more in the way he said Becky Shea's name. Like he was surprised, but was mixed in with anger for the both of us. It wasn't even his words, just the tone in his voice and then the color change in his eyes and face. Do you remember what he said? As close to exact as possible? Charlie's eyes were glossed over and kind of droopy or lazy and dark. I can picture him right now as if he were standing in front of us. I mean, me. Rowdy's voice quivered a bit. He asked me, why did you have to bring Becky Shea? You didn't ask if it was okay with me? He paused. I didn't think you'd care, Charlie. You like her okay, don't you? Rowdy began having a one-sided conversation as if he could hear how Charlie was responding, but Charlie's half of the conversation was silent to the room. I thought so. That's why I brought her. She's more like one of us than anybody else, Charlie. She won't tell anyone else. She already promised me. Rowdy stood up from the couch and began nervously pacing the confines of the room. Come on, Charlie, don't be like that. I know it's only yours and my place, but it's time to have other club members, don't you think? We're the Three Musketeers. You've said it yourself. He stopped pacing. What? What do you mean you like her too? Rowdy turned to his right and continued talking as if Becky were next to him. Who do you like best, Becky Shea? Me or Charlie? Rowdy paused as if he were awaiting her to answer. No, don't say that. What do you mean? Why didn't you tell me ahead of time? I wouldn't have ever brought you here. I'm in love with you, Becca Shea. I've never felt... Never mind. You and Charlie can just have each other. Rowdy took several steps across the office and then dropped quickly to his knees and began crawling as if he were on the pipe bridge, quickly scooting away. He looked back. Don't follow me, Becca Shea. I'm not coming back. Ever. He turned back forward and continued carefully crawling. He suddenly stopped and twisted back, facing behind him. It's okay, Becca Shea. Stay there. I'll turn around and help you. Just hang on. He slowly began to turn as if he were carefully maintaining his balance. I've almost got it. Rowdy paused and then began shaking before he rolled off to the side and onto his back, flailing his arms and legs, yelling, Becca Shea! As quickly as he rolled off and over to his back, he became still as a rock. His arms and legs twisted into positions on the office floor that appeared unnatural and painful. The office became deafeningly silent. Doc slowly got up and walked over to where Rowdy lay quietly, his eyes shut and completely still. He knelt and touched Rowdy's arm and lightly shook it. Rowdy, you're okay, buddy. Rowdy's eyes began to twitch before they slowly opened. His arms wriggled and he grumbled in a pained tone. His eyes darted back and forth before traveling up and meeting Doc's. Charlie? His pupils appeared dilated for a moment and then appeared to adjust in focus like a camera lens. Is Becky Shea okay? I saw her. I fell and she reached out and then she fell too. You're okay, Rowdy. Becky Shea's okay too. Doc continued to pat Rowdy's arm. I saw her though. She fell into the abyss of Hell's Gate. I saw her. I crawled over and looked inside. I saw the hand, the long claws. It's okay, Rowdy. I promise Becky Shea is just fine. She can't be. It's all my fault. The hand, it grabbed her when I reached it to try and help. Rowdy's eyes flooded with tears. I tried to save her, Charlie. The devil pulled her away from me and into this darkness. I couldn't. I tried to climb over the edge and... Doc began to lightly shake Rowdy's shoulder again, this time with a little more force. He looked over toward his office door as a silhouette appeared in the frosted glass panel. I'm sore, Charlie. I tried. I'm sorry. The doorknob slowly rotated counterclockwise before a click of the latch allowed the door to begin swinging open. The figure slowly peeked around from the door before stepping into the office. Charlie? The female voice called out. Are you in here? Her hand reached for the wall, her fingers trailing across until they touched the light switch. Becky, don't turn the light on just yet. What's going on, Charlie? She called out in question. It's late. I was worried. Are you okay? I'm with Rowdy. Rowdy Bugner? From Pontoon Elementary? She continued to quietly step further into Charlie's office. He's a patient. He's in here on the floor. You should probably leave. Rowdy moved and attempted to lift his head towards her voice. Becky Shea? Is that you? Rowdy's body tensed. Is that really you? You're alive? Doc squeezed Rowdy's arm tighter and leaned in. It's okay, Rowdy. It's Becky. She's just fine. He then turned to Becky and motioned with his head for her to step in closer. He then quietly made a shushing sound to cue her in to coming in quietly. Becky Shea is alive and well, Rowdy. Can you sit up? I don't understand, Doc. What's going on? She fell just after I fell and... Rowdy, you did fall. And Becky fell too, but that was a long time ago, friend. But I saw the slimy hand with long claws. It pulled her away where where I couldn't reach her to save her. It was my fault. She followed me across that damn pipe bridge. I'm okay, Rowdy. We both lived through that accident. That's what it was, Rowdy. Nobody's fault. It was an unfortunate accident, Becky answered with an almost whispered hushed tone. She's right, Rowdy. You both survived the accident. That was almost 50 years ago, my friend. What? Then where have I been all this time? I can't believe Hell's Gate was real. I'm sorry, Rowdy. I should never have told you that name and scary story. It's all my fault. All these years, it's been all my fault. But where have I been if that's true? We're all here in my office, Rowdy. I'm a doctor here. We're at the Conway County Mental Sanitarium, Charlie replied. Where? What, for 50 years? I'm sorry, Rowdy. I truly am very, very sorry. My life has all just been a dream? A nightmare? Rowdy struggled to get up, his body now tensed and stiff. But you and Becky Shea are still here? I couldn't just leave you. Rowdy, you're my best friend, Doc answered. It's all been my fault. I thought you were dead that day, both of you. Take me there, Charlie. Where, Rowdy? The pipe bridge. I want to see our spot again. It doesn't look like it used to, Rowdy. I need to see it. Is the pipe bridge still there? Does it still cross the Petite Jean? I haven't been there for years, Rowdy. I couldn't make myself go back. I've not been there for over 40-some years, Doc Charlie replied. I haven't either, Rowdy, Becky echoed. Please, Charlie, my entire life has been trapped in that spot. I have to see it to put it behind me. I'm begging you. I don't know, Rowdy. You owe me, Charlie. I don't want to put it like... But you owe me that much. Charlie looked over at Becky Shea. I think we should. Should all three go? Becky Shea replied. 4. Charlie had been correct. The area had changed considerably. Neighborhoods now adorned the area alongside the river and gorge that once was only wooded forests and weeds. They parked on a circle drive that held a path down to the rocky bluff where the pipe bridge still stretched outward over the edge and then across the stretch of a small channel of the Petite Jean River. The rocky island still rested underneath that bridge about halfway across, the spot where Rowdy's life became encapsulated in a mental jar of sorts for almost 50 years. Rowdy's eyes panned out across the horizon that fit nestled tightly between two large multi-level homes overlooking the Petite Jean River and the old, now dilapidated pipe bridge. The sun gleamed across the rolling river as the three reunited friends slowly made their way down a weed-covered path to the spot the cement-encased pipe left the rocky covering and stretched outward away from solid ground on scattered pylons, reaching the surface of the water before disappearing below it. He looked back at Charlie and Becky Shea as he slowly straddled the pipe, his much older legs wrapping tightly on either side of the half-pipe protruding above the concrete encasement. He looked back with an odd gleam in his eyes before he began sliding one knee forward and then the other. Once he got about 10 feet over the rocky edge, he turned back again and saw his best friend Charlie helping Becky Shea onto the pipe. Homeowners began clambering out onto their decks once they noticed 3 older adults scooting across the old landmark bridge. They turned and spoke from across one deck to the other, but it was all just jumbled hollering to the 3 people now almost halfway across the bridge. The sound of the river's movement mixing with the sounds of the residents in the background created an odd, eclectic, muffled mix. Rowdy looked off to his left where the forest once stood tall with twisted white-barked trees covering Charlie's and his hideout. Those trees now all gone, making Rowdy's memory feel foggy and discombobulated. The familiarity of the moment now slipped away like the years between back then and now had done. Years vanished in an instant. He glanced behind him, seeing his best friend moving slowly behind the girl. The only girl he had ever fallen in love with. That once beautiful time in his childhood awoken to a truth of being stolen and then turned into a lifetime of guilt and remorse. He looked down below as he sat perched directly above Hellgate's dark opening in the earth. In this small flicker of his life, he suddenly felt the fear that distant moment he had tried to reach for Becky Shea's hand to save her from the devil hiding inside the shadows. A small tear formed perfectly in the corner of each eye, as if it had taken 50 long years to crystallize and perfect the tiny glistening drops of liquid now adorning his face. Had his best friend betrayed him? He never asked the question, which had immediately formed in his brain, but he noticed the matching rings on each of their fingers. It immediately caused a painful sting in his heart upon realizing his best friend must have ended up with the love of his life while he remained trapped in a horrible replaying nightmare, his sweet dreams stolen while he remained helpless and unaware. The devil obviously letting go of Becky's hand, releasing her to Charlie and instead grabbing hold of his, pulling him into a dark and unending world he thought he had escaped. Rowdy's legs began to tremble without control. He felt a shimmy in the old brittle concrete structure as it rumbled below his knees. The pipe he sat on began growing hot to his butt as if boiling water were beginning to flow inside the round iron interior. He lifted himself up onto his knees, which now had grown in size with time and age, now large enough to overhang the edges of the flat, rough concrete edges. He lifted one hand, which had helped stabilize his body's precarious perch, so he could twist and look back behind him once again to his friends from his past, the ones who betrayed him. They appeared to feel nothing of the heat or rumble within the structure that held them hovering above the rocky island in the middle of the Petit Jean River. Charlie and Becky Shea continued to make their way closer to Hell's Gate and their old friend. Rowdy began to return his gaze away and back to the ground below, causing his balance to teeter. His loose hand reached forward, attempting to latch on to anything his fingers could grasp as the bridge began to rattle and shake beneath him. He lost his balance and fell over the side, catching the rough concrete edge with his fingers. Feet dangling, swinging back and forth from the momentum of the fall tugged at his fingers, and they began slipping as his knuckles became whiter by the second. Tiny pieces of cement began to break away from under his grip. Becky screamed out, "Rowdy, hang on!" He turned and saw the fright in her face as Charlie struggled to lean past her enough to see what was happening. "Hang on, Rowdy!" Charlie yelled. There were screams from the residents' decks as they watched helplessly while Rowdy's body hung from the bridge's crumbling ledge. Rowdy looked over at Becky Shea one last time, mouthing the words, "I love you," before glancing back down to Hell's Gate, which seemed to be calling his name to come home. His fingers straightened out as the concrete crumbled into dust, forcing his free fall into the dark chasm below. Becky Shea and Charlie watched helplessly as Rowdy disappeared into the black hole, unable to witness the clawed fist snatch Rowdy into its clutches and quickly pull him into his grip, forever disappearing into the darkness of the gate into Hell's entrance. Rowdy's body was never recovered, and Becky Shea and her husband Charlie never spoke another word about any of what happened after the case was closed on Rowdy Lee Williams. Charlie did answer the call from the state's warrant to turn over his notebook on Rowdy's treatment for the almost 50 years he had spent under the care of the Conway County Mental Sanitarium. The notes were very sparse, and Charlie claimed patients' privacy beyond the notes, never answering questions asked. He eventually lost his license to practice care in the medical field in the state of Arkansas, and he and his wife, Becky Shea, moved to a small town on Florida's Forgotten Coast upon his forced retirement. Neighbors of homes within sight of the pipe bridge still standing over Hell's Gate profess to hear a voice they claim are of Rowdy Lee calling out to his childhood love, Becky Shea Cahill. To this very day, on nights the moon saturates the sky with its round glowing fullness, the words, "I love you, Becky Shea," can be heard whispering through the pylons of the pipe bridge near the small town of Pontoon, Arkansas.
Well, the first thing you need to know about the Bride of the Embalmer is that they always made a big deal out of funerals in Eben. I don't mean the way they do around here. I don't mean covered dishes and weeping, sitting with the dead, any of those sorts of traditions. These graves here would never meet Eben code. Eben funerals are a little closer to a second-line procession or a Dia de los Muertos celebration, but that only gets you halfway to the truth. For one thing, the people of Eben have no real sadness or fear of death. You can hear it in the way they talk about the afterlife, devoted and earnest, like lovers waiting for the right moment to meet in the sunlight. Not that the sun burns the mist off Eben very often. Eben is in some thick, old-growth forest. But it's as if the entire town averts itself from the rhythms of daylight. It is somehow always twilight, and lights are kept on in every window in every house, strung between every building. Red and white lanterns rock in every gnarled old tree. All the street lamps flicker one by one as the funeral march passes, singing along the bank of the resentful little river that trickles through town. Fish are one of Eben's only exports, and the ones that come from the river are strange as you'd expect. Little purple terrors with long teeth that curve light like funhouse glass. They're sweet, though, succulent and dense, with pale flesh that glows like moonlight. And no Eben funeral worth any salt at all would be caught without them. No, Eben funerals are more like weddings. There's cake, dancing, shouting and laughing, sometimes confetti. Their doves are delicately roasted and stuffed full of spider figs, drizzled with a rich honey sauce. People in Eben don't have much, and wouldn't think of setting free something you can eat on, metaphor or no. Everyone wears their best and thinks jealously of the day they'll get to be the one sitting in the processional throne, walked to the altar, given away to the earth by their widows and children, trading the mean shackles of existence for whatever comes after the final dark. Most towns have a mayor to help the townsfolk through times of trouble and joy. But in Eben, no one matters more than the embalmer. A round, smiling man with bright black eyes and a thick, bristly mustache. He prepares all of Eben's dead for the journey to come, plumping cheeks and coloring lips, hiding imperfections and stitching up accidents. It's often said that the people of Eben look better spent than they ever did in the full bloom of life, and the embalmer has a way of catching everyone's finest attributes on the end of his brush, or hook, or knife. All Eben funerals are presided over by the embalmer and his art, and all are celebrations of the life that waits after death. The other thing they have in common is that they are all, without exception, burials. So imagine the reaction when the embalmer's bride passed, his most singular and truest love, and at the public reading of the documents on her willing day, it was revealed that she wanted her body to be burned instead to ash. Wait, go back. I've skipped too far ahead. Let me lean here on the shovel for a moment and think. This is something that happens when you spend too much time in Eben. Moments spooling out of order, time as stretched and folded on itself as the sweet taffy they make from beetle paste. The embalmer had got himself a wife in the traditional way, through love and courtship, long before he was the embalmer, and he treasured her. Quick-witted and clever, she helped him pass every exam, learn every trick of post-mortem surgery, and they moved together to Eben not long after that. She had a tongue sharp as a lash, and we all felt it sting on occasion. You could hear them screaming at each other sometimes all the way down here in town, and woe betide those who got in her way at the butcher. But the embalmer liked an excessive spirit, and their love sparked just as intensely, burned just as hot. Some say they can see the mark of her on every face he's done. The red lips, the delicate rose blush he puts on every cheek, the mark of the man's tender regard for his beloved. She took to the mean, gloomy little town, walking around the streets like imported sunlight, brushing grave moss off the oldest headstones, reminding everyone that what came next was surely better. And coming from one like her, well, there was no question of belief, just faith. Soon, that's what everyone called her, Faith. And they loved her nearly as much as the embalmer himself did. Certainly, they loved her more than they loved the embalmer. So it was with immense, bittersweet exultation that the embalmer walked from their cottage next to the graveyard on the edge of town one morning and announced that his wife had met death in the night. People weren't sad, exactly. I told you no one is sad about death in Eben. But there was some disappointment at her length of stay on Earth as they went about planning the funeral of a lifetime. The embalmer worked feverishly on his dead wife, and when the time came for the procession, the wife paraded through town on the throne in the traditional way. It was widely agreed that he had never done better. The lips so red, the cheeks so pink, those lifeless eyes are still glittering with memory. That hair is a cascade of satin. When the wife slipped from her chair once, the scarlet silk of her wedding turned funeral dress tearing just enough that we thought we could see where a fine silken stitch had pulled flesh back together over the stick of a knife to the heart. We thought nothing of it. Post-mortem embellishments were not uncommon after all, and the embalmer was allowed affectations. No one could question the depth of his love for his dearest wife. The funeral came and went, the wife interred in the cemetery's finest plot. Never had more flowers been thrown at the feet of the embalmer. Never had townsfolk danced so joyously, screamed so loudly, ate so many stuffed doves as they did for the wife. The town gossiped about who would take over her duties, who would bake the funeral cake and visit the sick and dying, who could tend the funeral doves and pick the spider figs. There was no question of the embalmer marrying again. Who could hope to follow true love? Except only 2 months after the embalmer's wife found her way to death's door and crossed eternity's threshold, the embalmer walked into the tavern on a cold, rattling kind of November night, and on his arm was another girl in a scarlet dress, thinner and paler than the last. The journey, the embalmer said, hadn't been easy for his new young wife, a sister to the one he'd lost, and if it weren't for the dark circles under eyes that were blue instead of green, blonde hair so fine and fair as to be all but white where the first sister had been raven and wild, we might have thought it the dead walking, so alike they were. She looked around the tavern with something like interest, but her eyes were filled with a wary sort of distance we had no way to measure. We put it down to the miles she traveled, over bad roads in bad weather, and welcomed her coldness as best we knew. You see how slippery it can be to tell a story of Eben like a live eel twisting against the fire. Now I've gone and made myself one of them in the telling, part of we. And I suppose I was. The embalmer's new wife settled into a comfortable pattern in Eben, even if she did take to wandering the forest late at night when most good things were meant to be abed, searching for something she never did find. She had an odd habit of turning up in strange houses in the morning. We soon got used to her drifting here and there throughout the cold winter, taking advantage of any open door, any available fireside. She had a way of pressing unexpectedly close to a person, her silent mouth as urgent in the moment as her eyes were far away and seeking. We never discussed this with each other. We missed the first wife, her tender regard, her effortless competence and easy smile, her harpy screech of disapproval, her ability to stay put in her own house with her own husband. We were polite enough to not say as much to her sister, who settled into the duties of an embalmer's wife as poorly as she'd settled into being a bride. At least she had no outspoken opinions on our moral character. It was her only, finest asset. The new wife was as soft-spoken and breathy as the first wife had been shrill, and took up as little space as her sister had taken up everything. She was so quiet that when we asked her name that first night in the tavern, no one could hear it fade out into the well-lit room, and we made her repeat it over and over, the name slithering clear out of our heads every time. After that, we gave up on hearing her speak and just called her Patience. Patience came and went by the time the new leaves began to unfurl, taken overnight by a sudden fever. Once again, Eben held a grand funeral, if not quite as grand as the first. Funeral expenses are what they are. But there were plenty of small fish, if not so many doves. Once again, the embalmer drew her face fine and beautiful as ever, and once again he consigned a wife to the grave wearing a scarlet dress. This time, silk and thread stitched the red mouth up tight. This was, he said, to keep the fever trapped inside. The embalmer spent all of that wet spring and the next sullen summer without a wife. From town, we could see him moving around in the graveyard, lights going on and off in the cottage and his tiny workroom at all hours, losing himself in the work. There was plenty of it. The summer was wet and cold, and a few of our finest residents were lucky enough to ride by accident or illness to the grave. We had the usual funerals, danced the usual dances, wondered when it would be our turn to carry on past this miserable life. Harvest came in thick enough for a lean, careful winter, and this was around the same time the newest bride arrived. The embalmer came into the tavern filled with a transcendent joy, his signature scent of lilies and decay mixed with the sharp tang of embalming fluid, the subtle and unmistakable perfume of most joyous celebration. His new bride had finally come, but she was shy and reclusive, and he hoped in time she would feel comfortable enough to meet Eben properly. Until then, would we give them the time to settle in together? We would. We watched the lights go on and off in the small cottage from afar, the embalmer and his bride dancing around each other, two shadows rotating like heavenly bodies pulled inexorably towards each other, yet never connecting. Oh, I'm sorry for the dirt flying in your face. You don't mind, do you? It's just that the grave is so tight, the pool of lantern light so thin against this blackest of new moons. It's hard for me to see where it ends and you begin. I suppose there's no better place to listen than from all the way down here at the bottom, eh? But you wanted the story, didn't you? And all desire comes with consequence. The newest bride's funeral was announced before we ever saw her come out of the shadows and into the light. The announcement was found nailed to the front of the town hall in the first flush of the morning, and with it the bride's instructions to be burned to ash. What hue! What outcry! Stranger or no, surely the embalmer had taught her the sanctity of our ways, the privilege of transition, and a decaying corpse, the joy of the throne and the procession. Would she deny us her death as well as her life? The cottage remained shuttered tight against the midday, and no amount of hammering on the door could raise the embalmer. Reluctantly, we did as her willing requested. Dry snags and twisted old trees were pulled into the center of town, mixed with bouquets of rosemary and angelica root and asphodel, the small peels of oranges and withered apples, pine pitch and tar. Her throne-shaped pyre was set in the town square next to the altar. Doves were caught and stuffed, pumpkins steamed and filled with crushed violets and sage, eels roasted, instruments tuned, buntings draped. We prepared that night for a different funeral than any we'd known, taking what comfort we could from the usual trappings of celebration. Just as the gray sky darkened to purple and the sun began to slink past the boundary of the known world, the door to the Embalmer's cottage flung open, and emerging from it, stately and graceful as ever in life, if it turned out a bit less cohesive, came the Embalmer's bride. Behind her in the mud dragged the tattered trail of a scarlet gown, and wrapped into it, struggling madly, the Embalmer himself. Thus did Faith Patience, the bride of the Embalmer, come to meet the town. She stopped in front of her pyre, the scent of rank decay and sweet lilies settling around us all like a final, lingering kiss. We stood captive and spellbound before her. From one blue eye, Patience gazed vacantly over the silent town, and from one green eye, Faith raked us all with wordless fury. We could see clearly the landscape of the Embalmer's work. Clean, delicate stitchwork crossed the lovely face like boundary rivers in a map marking the outer limits of a land beyond our understanding. What he had done was nothing short of astonishing, a true monument to his intelligence, his will, his endless, unstoppable love for Faith, that not even the sacrosanct testament of the other side should keep him from his love. He had grafted 2 wives into one. You are right to scream. It is truly amazing, sirs, what relentless determination and artistry can do to an immobilized body. To 2 bodies, when it comes to that. But back to our story. You came all this way for it and must see it to the end. Surely you have an inkling where we're headed. Her red lips parted, those bloated white cheeks blooming with the peach of the Embalmer's brush rose as she smiled. From deep inside the black maw of her decaying mouth, we could see the line of stitches bisecting one tongue and connecting another. Faith Patience spoke, using patient softness, a series of words that are forever burned into memory. "I'm very sorry," Patience said. "My husband has done terrible things, and I am the least terrible of them. I'm so sorry to be such an inconvenience." From behind her came the sound of the Embalmer choking on the gag of red silk stuffed into his mouth, trussed as he was, like a funeral dove ready for the roasting. We quivered with rage to see him debased so. She stopped, her swollen throat convulsing suddenly, and closed her eyes. Her hands flexed creaking fists at her sides. Faith blazed from the one green eye, trying desperately to force Patience's meek tongue into iron. "A sly and honest murderer. In a moment of anger, he struck Faith through our heart. In a moment of cruelty, he poisoned sweet Patience for our parts. The problem, he believed, was Faith's tongue, not his dagger hand, not his twisted desire. The problem was Patience's softness, not his depravity. And the worst of this is that he has abandoned you all, townsfolk of Eben. Despite every missive you hold most holy, he has not let us cross to the other side. We, Faith Patience, the Embalmer's bride, will cross tonight, and we will take our husband so that he might answer for his crimes. We watched, paralyzed, as draped in determined glory and with a sweep of her tattered gown, Faith Patience sat on the pyre we had constructed for her, the embalmer screaming and writhing against his bonds at her feet, and with a small, self-satisfied smile, set herself alight. What happened next is a matter of public record, of course. Officially, the fire broke free of the confines of the pyre and spread, first to the bunting, then to the dance floor, from the dance floor to the butcher shop filled with tallow and fat, and soon the entire town was aflame, fires burning off Eben's deepest shadows with more illumination than the town had ever known. As for the embalmer, that poor man, driven to deny his life's work, his moral compass, his righteous, tender shepherding of souls to the shores of eternity, in order to right the wrong he'd done in the heat of rages so red and intense he had no memory of them. That tortured soul who wanted only to bring his dead wife back, that his love might erase all past transgressions, that he and she might start anew and anew and anew? Some say he burned up in the fires that reduced all of Eben to ash, the bride's final gift to the town she loved. Others say he broke free and ran shrieking through the town with the bride chasing after, her flaming arms open in a final embrace. That this is how the town really burned. Those who believe this look for him here and there still, near cold stone and grave dirt at midnight. But as you have come to understand, sirs, they never return. The truth is, no one still living knows what happened to me.
I inherited a collection of paranormal VHS tapes from my uncle. What a pity that I was able to find a VCR.
So, you're trying to cash in on this whole analog horror fad? Is that it?
The eccentrically dressed yet curmudgeonly old shopkeeper asked as he disinterestedly pawed through the jumbled collection of off-brand VHS tapes I had brought for him. I couldn't say that I blamed Mr. Orville Bucklesby one bit for his lack of enthusiasm. If you believed even a half of the stories about him, he had fought Nazi occultists in World War II, traveled the multiverse with a supernatural circus, and regularly rubbed shoulders with the plethora of paranormal beings that allegedly haunted and visited Heroic County. His oddity shop was stocked with a myriad of bizarre items, some of them of questionable authenticity to be sure, but all of them were more interesting than a few humble VHS cartridges.
Analog horror? No, it's nothing like that, sir. I was just thinking that there might be people out there who could get better use out of these than I could, and that you would know how to get in touch with those people, I said with a nonchalant shrug. He eyed me suspiciously as he started reading over the labels on the tapes.
What's with the cryptic titles then?
He asked.
This one's called And We All Fall Down. They're all like that. You've got Crying Girl in the Woods, It's Already Too Late, Why Won't She Forgive Me, etc. This one here just says, Pity Us. What's supposed to be on these things?
Well, Mr. Bucklesby, I've been given to understand that you're familiar with the type of device referred to as an inglorious retrovision. Is that correct? I asked, hesitantly. Part of me was hoping that he would say no, that he would scoff at the very question, and I could go home and shove the videotapes back in the basement and forget about them. But he didn't. Instead, his expression changed from annoyed
to serious, and he eyed the tapes with a renewed sense of cautious interest.
You own a retrovision then, do you, son?
He asked, avoiding eye contact with me. No, but my uncle did, I replied. He tinkered around with it and was able to hook up a VCR. Throughout the 80s and 90s, he recorded various signals he picked up on it, right up until his death. And with practically his dying breath, he told me to unhook the VCR and hide it with the tape collection, and I did. Not even a day later, the retrovision was gone. But the tapes were left untouched. I don't know who took it or how they knew about my uncle's death so quickly, but I can only assume they didn't know about the tapes. I was terrified that they'd find out about the modifications and come back for the tapes, but they never did. And they've been in my possession ever since. My uncle told me never to watch the tapes alone, and I was too scared to ever tell anyone else about them, so I've never watched them. I don't know what's on them, but I know of the things you can see on a retrovision. So I figured they might be worth something to the right buyer.
Your uncle's been dead 20 years or so then? Why are you only selling them now?
Orville asked, arching his eyebrows skeptically. Well, I was pretty much still a kid when he died, and by the time I was old enough to start looking into my uncle's occult connections, I'd largely forgotten about the tapes, I explained. I just recently started poking around on heroichollows.net to see if I could find anything that might have had anything to do with my uncle, and that's how I found out about this place.
You don't say. Maybe I ought to take out an ad on that site,
he mused.
You didn't happen to notice if Eve across the street was running any ads there, did you?
I didn't notice any ads at all while I was there, actually, I answered. There's a short forum thread about her, though. The prevailing opinion seemed to be that she's not much more than an Instagram psychic.
I have no idea what that means, but I love it,
he cackled.
Anywho, back to business. You're saying that these tapes are recordings from a retrovision that your uncle made, but other than that, you have no idea what's on them?
That's correct, sir, yes. I nodded dutifully. He let out a single grunt as he pensively weighed the video cassette in his hands.
Listen, kid, before I make you an offer, I am going to have to check at least a few of these to make sure they're legit,
he said, nodding to the 13-inch TV VCR combo he already had waiting on his desk.
You okay with me popping this in?
I hesitated for a moment. I knew before I came in that he would need to watch the videos, and I had been looking forward to finally seeing what was on the tapes myself. But after so many years of avoiding the tapes, I was perhaps understandably wary of what would happen when I finally unlocked their secrets. If you think it's safe, then yes, go ahead, I said with a reluctant nod.
No need to be so melodramatic. We're still talking about 20 to 40-year-old VHS recordings,
Orville said as he popped the tape that said "Pity Us" into the VCR and pressed play. After a few seconds of static, a grainy and desaturated image of a man in a chair appeared on screen. The chair was cast from rusted steel and starkly utilitarian in design, while the room he was sitting in was bare concrete, as far as we could see. The man was completely bald, with a drawn and haggard face. His eyes were a jaundiced yellow, and his skin was browned like aged paper and hung loosely off his face, as if he had recently lost an enormous amount of weight. His clothes were ragged and woven from some coarse and faded fabric, and I wondered if he was a political prisoner of some kind. He certainly gave off the impression of being an innocent man who had suffered greatly and unjustly, his eyes begging the viewer for pity. He held his gaze on the camera for a few seconds, looked down at a scrap of paper in his hands, and then cleared his throat
It wasn't our fault.
He spoke in a hoarse voice that just barely managed to be louder than a whisper.
They demanded sacrifice. They demanded obedience. We could not resist. All of our strength of mind and of will and of flesh was sacrificed in their name, and we had become too weak to resist. The need to feed the engines of war has left our world nearly bereft of life, and yet it was an industry that left us starved and impoverished, beaten and maimed, wasted from disease. That was what was demanded of us. Then we feed all the world to the signal until there was nothing left, and never dared to take so much as an extra serving of gruel for ourselves. All that was created went to the cause. We sacrificed so much, and we have nothing left to sacrifice anymore. We couldn't have defied them even if we wanted to, and all we wanted was respite from our ordeal. What else could anyone be expected to want? When we were finally no longer of any use, we had no more to give. They said that it was finally time for us to be rewarded, and that our reward was to be one of transcendence. They said that the signal would help us achieve enlightenment, to help us understand that the ruined world was our reward, that it was better this way, quieter. But it didn't work. The signal twisted them, and now it's twisting us, and we can't stop. We hear it now, always, no matter what. And it will take all it can from us, until we are nothing but wretched and forlorn. And even then, it will not be sated. The signal will not be stopped. Cannot be stopped. Can you hear it?
Sure enough, I did. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was some sort of signal playing over the man's speech. It was subtle, easy enough to think nothing of at first, but now that my attention had been drawn to it, I found it a very unsettling sort of sound, like a theremin, but not quite, fluctuating between high and low tones so rapidly it seemed almost random, but some cadence of a pattern was undeniably present. It wasn't music, though, more like Morse code. Like it was trying to desperately communicate some sort of message that it couldn't risk falling into the wrong hands.
Oh no. No.
Orville mumbled as he desperately began pressing pause, stop, and eject on the VCR. When the tape continued to play, he knocked the TV to the ground. Before I could ask what the hell had come over him, he picked up his hickory cane and swung it towards the TV to smash it. He never made contact, though. The TV was gone. His shop was gone. Our world was gone. Instead, it was just he and I in a desolate, abandoned city. The buildings and infrastructure were all starkly utilitarian in their design, all gray and hard and cold, just like the chair and room the man had been sitting in. Other than Orville and myself, there wasn't a speck of color or living thing in sight. There was no ambient noise at all. The air was still and yet smelt of an oncoming storm, and the lumpy clouds overhead were so motionless I wouldn't have been surprised to learn I was looking at a painted ceiling.
Son of a bitch!
Orville screamed in frustration as he dropped to his knees, striking at the empty space where the TV had been. I, on the other hand, just stood there in stupefied silence. I had never been translocated before, and my brain was struggling to comprehend what had just happened.
Of course, that's what pity us meant. So stupid.
Orville cursed himself. Orville, what are you talking about? What's happening? Where are we? I managed to ask. He let out a long sigh before turning to look at me with a dismal expression.
The realm of the forlorn,
he replied grimly.
It's a world ravaged by years and decades of escalating psychotronic warfare until there was nobody left to fight. That was a psychotronic signal you heard, and once it was deep enough into our brains, it pulled us into this reality. Your uncle must have come across it on the retrovision like someone stepping on an old landmine.
I stared at him incredulously for a moment, trying to decide whether or not I believed him. The otherworldly hue to the gray light falling on the empty, brutalist buildings all around us pushed me towards the former.
You really have visited other realities before, haven't you?
I murmured softly as I tried to remember all the crazy stories I had read about him.
Let's just say I've had some on-the-job experience in a few exotic locales,
he said as he pushed himself back onto his feet.
Listen up. The most important thing right now is for you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you. The psychotronic weapons the governments of this world use to torture their enemies and subjugate their own citizens penetrated deeper and deeper until the very fabric of their reality started to unravel. That's why the signal can leak out into other realities. It's how we got pulled in, and it's also how we can get back. We need to find the weak spot we fell through and use it to cross back over before we're no longer compatible with our own reality.
What the hell does that mean? I demanded.
It's not a productive area of conversation at the moment, is what it means.
Orville snapped back.
Give me your phone, now.
Exasperated, I reached into my pocket and grabbed it. I checked the signal strength before handing it to him. I've got no bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing, I explained.
That won't matter to who I'm calling,
he said, snatching it out of my hand. I swear the number he punched into it was just the number 7, 11 times over. But despite that, and the absence of anything resembling a cellular network, I heard the phone start to ring.
Come on, Gary, don't put me on hold. Oh, and kid, keep quiet. We don't want to attract any attention to ourselves.
Me? You're the one who cursed bloody murder and assaulted the ground the instant we got here, I reminded him. For a second, he looked like he was going to backtalk me, but then I saw his face twist into a terrified grimace as he realized I was right.
Oh no,
he murmured as he began darting his head around in every direction. I didn't know what he was looking for, but I started looking around too, thinking that whatever it was, I'd probably know it when I saw it. Sure enough, I did. Another person had appeared in the distance and was slowly making their way towards us. If I was judging the distance right, the person looked to be around 7 feet tall. They were covered head to toe in a coarse gray fabric without any exposed skin at all. Their face and head covered by a veil and pointed hood. Their gait was shuffling and their head was hung low, and I wasn't even sure they were aware of us.
Orville, do you see?
I started whispering.
Cheese it,
he shouted, sprinting off towards one of the nearby buildings. There was a mortal fear and desperate urgency in his voice, which strongly suggested that I should obey without question, but instead my gaze was drawn back to the beings slowly making their way towards me. Their body language and the way they were moving made it seem like they might be hurt or otherwise be in need of assistance, generating just enough pity in me to stave off my sense of self-preservation for the moment. Hello? Hello? Are you all right? I called out cautiously, slowly raising my hand in greeting. The being tossed back their head and let out an ear-splitting wail. It wasn't an aggressive or predatory call, but a forlorn and heart-wrenching sob of abject misery. I reflexively slammed my hands over my ears, but as much as the wail pained and terrified me, I still couldn't will myself to abandon this creature. I almost felt like I was looking at the survivor of a nuclear bomb or something. They weren't a monster, but instead had been disfigured by something monstrous. I even began to weep. I felt such genuine empathy for this person who had once surely not been so very different from me. But then, their wails were joined by a chorus of equally tortured howls from all around us, and more of the strange beings began slowly shambling towards me. That, thankfully, was enough to finally get my fight-or-flight response into full gear, and I dashed into the building Orville had disappeared into.
Orville!
I shouted, desperately searching for any sign of him. He didn't reply, but he had left a clear path in the dust and debris that littered the floor of the long-abandoned and deteriorating building. I raced toward the stairwell he had used, but the wailing around me became so intense, I stumbled to the ground and clutched my head out of sheer agony. They were in the building now, the forlorn, and their wretched voices echoed off the hard concrete and seemed to be amplified 100-fold. Worse than the volume, though, was that I could now make out whispered voices amidst the wailing.
Can you hear it? The signal and the noise. It calls to all. It is subtle, but it is relentless. It must be heard, and bit by bit, it remains the world until it is omnipresent and unignorable. It took every sense but sound from us. It's in our ears. It's in our heads. It's in our voices and in our footsteps. In the rustling of our rags and the creaking of our bones. It is our very heartbeat. It is every sound we hear and every sound we make. It is everything to us now. It cannot be ignored or denied. It demands service. It demands sacrifice. We have sacrificed everything that could not be of service to it. We have sacrificed so much, suffered so much, and yet the signal will never be sated. So long as we can serve it, we must suffer. It will never release us. It is louder than us now. Can you even hear us? If you can, then please, please. Pity.
I forced myself to look up and saw several of them standing before me, scuttling towards me as quickly as they could manage. One of them screamed louder than the others, the silhouette of a gaunt and gaping face faintly visible beneath its veil. I watched as it slowly outstretched a trembling arm towards me. It was begging for help. They all were. I was sure of it. They had been suffering in this place for so long and were so desperate, they just gravitated towards any possible hope of salvation. How could they not? How could I deny them that? Slowly, reluctantly, and almost forcibly, I reached out towards the creature. The instant before our hands touched, I heard a hoarse battle cry ring out from behind me, and I saw a wooden cane strike the creature across the skull, knocking it to the floor. Orville had come back for me.
Cheese it means move, kid.
He shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me up the stairwell. The forlorn plodded up the stairs after us, but their clumsy gaits were unable to match our speed. I imagined that wasn't of much concern to them, though. Where were we supposed to go, after all? I was just about to voice that concern when I saw the doorway Orville was pulling me towards was filled with a softly glowing white fog.
What is? No time.
Now, I obviously didn't have a lot of time to analyze the situation in any real detail, but with the benefit of hindsight, I can safely say that at that moment, letting Orville drag me through what I could only presume was a portal to God knows where was a slightly less risky option than remaining in the realm of the forlorn. But only slightly. I didn't resist or try to escape, but I did scream as I was pulled through the doorway. Once we were over the threshold, the fog seemed to block all the noise coming from the other side. There was music, though. I think. Cheerful music that definitely wasn't coming from the realm of the forlorn, but it didn't last long enough for me to tell what it was. Orville and I came running out the other side, and the white light had been so bright that all I could see was spots at first. I crashed into a wall, but I heard Orville slam a door and shout something into my phone. By the time my vision cleared enough to see again, I realized we were back in Orville's shop. Orville was sitting with his back up against a door, but there was no longer any sign of glowing white fog on the other side. Orville looked exhausted, but relieved.
What? How did you?
I stammered.
Called in a favor from an old friend,
he said, holding up my phone. I heard a man on the other end saying something unintelligible, and Orville raised the phone to his ear.
What was? No, I don't owe you a favor. I called in a favor. You guys still owed me from last April. No, she didn't pay me for those, Gary. Scrip isn't real money. No, if I can't pay my taxes with it, it's not real money. Well, now, you're just opening up a whole can of worms about how all value is ultimately arbitrary. We'll talk about this later. Goodbye, and thank you.
He pressed end call and deleted the call from my phone's history before handing it back to me.
I'm only going to say 3 more words about what just happened. Don't pity them,
he said gruffly as he rose to his feet and ambled back to his desk. The TV VCR combo was still face up on the floor, but the VHS tape was sticking out of it. Orville bent down and disdainfully pulled it out and tossed it in the box with the others.
So, what will you take for the whole kit and caboodle?
I got out of there immediately, leaving my box of VHS tapes with Orville, without taking so much as a cent from him. He mailed me a check, though, oddly enough, but I haven't opened it. I'm just glad to be rid of those tapes after what happened. I wonder how my uncle was able to avoid getting pulled into the realm of the forlorn, or if he didn't, how he got back. He did tell me never to watch the tapes alone, so maybe he had a partner or something in case something like that happened. Maybe the answers are on more of the tapes. But if they are, I'm not brave enough to find them. One near-fatal reality slip is enough for me. Thank you very much. As terrifying as the ordeal was, I don't blame the forlorn one bit. Whether they actually thought I could help them or if they were just obeying the signal, I don't blame them. I was only under the influence of the signal for less than 20 minutes, and I still nearly gave into it. If it hadn't been for Orville, just the sheer good fortune of having watched that tape with someone who knew how to get back home, the fate of the forlorn would have been mine as well. They're innocent victims of the signal, and there's no way for me or anyone else to help them. Despite the fact they tried to trap me there with them, and despite what Orville said, I do pity them.
Scaling what had become his favorite sand dune, Landis made a concerted effort to excise all the trouble and thoughts churning inside his skull. The dune was no place for fretting or worrying about things beyond one's control. It was a place for soul healing and mind clearing, a happy place amongst all the death and uncertainty. Reaching the dune's apex, Landis got himself into a comfortable sitting position, then stared out across the vast glittering seascape that surrounded the island. The sight of it made quick work of the tension that had built up inside him, causing all the stress and anxiety he was feeling to melt away like ice in the Sahara.
Mesmerizing, isn't it?
Startled by the unexpected query, Landis sat bolt upright and jerked his head left to see who'd disturbed him. To his immense surprise, he found Mary Simmons, the Canadian journalist he had met the second night at sea, standing at the base of the dune, an awkward expression on her cute sunburnt face. Aside from the heavy bags under her eyes, she looked exactly as she had several days prior, uncommonly beautiful with her naturally warm skin tone, striking green eyes, and long curly hair. "Oh," Landis said, a mixture of anxiety and bitterness bubbling inside him. "What are you, doing here?"
Well,
Mary said, clasping her hands together sheepishly.
we just got done gathering up a bunch of materials from the jungle to build a new SOS sign, which we did on the other end of the beach.
She motioned to Landis's right to show him her handiwork, but Landis kept his gaze on her.
In any case, I worked up a pretty good sweat doing that, and was thinking about taking a dip. Then I saw you up here and figured we could talk, if you're so inclined.
Doing his best to keep the anxiety and bitterness at bay, Landis focused on her ensemble, which consisted of a white blouse, Daisy Duke-style shorts, and a pair of purple flip-flops. "You find a bathing suit, or do you plan on swimming in your clothes?"
Neither.
Mary said.
Skinny dipping all the way.
Landis frowned at her.
Kidding. I have a bathing suit on underneath.
"Funny. Were your swim plans all you wanted to discuss?"
Actually, I've been wanting to come see you since we arrived here. Things have just been so crazy.
Landis bobbed his head at that. Between scrambling for their lives after the explosions rocked the cruise ship, finding their way to this island in the dark, coping with the immense loss of life, and setting themselves up until help arrived, crazy fairly well encapsulated the last 48 hours. "Yeah, they have." He scooped up a handful of sand and absently let it drain through his fingers. "So, what'd you want to talk about?"
Come on, Brendan.
Mary said, using his first name instead of his last, which he preferred.
You know.
"Right, the high seas luau." He gazed back out at the glittering water, recalling the huge mixer. Being his first cruise, Landis hadn't been sure what to expect, so he decided to show up early. Mary, coincidentally, had done the same, heading straight to the bar in order to get ahead of the crowd. They ended up arriving at the same time, and Landis offered to buy her a drink. Mary had readily accepted, with the caveat that she be allowed to order for both of them. Landis said sure, and soon they were drinking Long Island iced teas and chatting like old friends. One drink led to two, and before long they moved to their own table for a little more privacy. Thereafter, conversation flowed easily, leading Landis to believe real chemistry existed between them. He had been on the verge of asking her to slow dance when, quite out of the blue, several of her friends had showed up and whisked her away, leaving Landis wondering what the hell he had done wrong. Things had gone to shit shortly after that, depriving him and his bruised ego the chance to confront her about it. Until now.
To set the record straight, my friends didn't rescue me from anything that night. They pulled me away to deal with some stupid drama between a married couple we came with. Had nothing at all to do with you.
Landis locked eyes with her, felt himself soften.
Seriously? Because up until they arrived, I really liked the way things were going.
Seriously. And I liked the way things were going too. I just wish I had come to tell you sooner.
Knees beginning to ache from sitting in the same position too long, Landis shifted around in the sand, straightening his legs.
So, did the married couple ever resolve their drama?
Mary's gaze fell to the sand and lingered there momentarily.
No. It continued into the early morning, when the explosions went off. They were near the third one that took out most of the lifeboats. I wound up being the only one from my group to make it to the island.
Oh, Jesus. I'm sorry,
Landis said.
That was stupid of me.
Mary shook her head.
No, it's okay.
Her gaze reconnected with his.
You know, I feel a bit silly talking to you from down here. Like a peasant beseeching their laird for more land or whatever. Mind if I join you?
Sure. Plenty of room up here.
Excellent, my lord,
Mary said, doing a little curtsy. She backed up a few paces, then bounded forward, scaling the dune in 9 hearty strides. At the top, she plopped down beside Landis and took a few beats to catch her breath.
I love your shirt, by the way.
Indicating his black Foo Fighters tee.
Everlong is like one of my all-time faves.
Landis beamed at this revelation. He couldn't have agreed more.
Yeah,
Mary went on.
That line about not stopping when I say when?
Geez, lady, where have you been all my life?
Mary didn't miss a beat.
Hello, I've waited here for you. Everlong.
They sang in unison, giggling at their collective corniness. After the giggling subsided, Mary stood back and took in the surrounding view.
Not bad, mon ami. I can see why you like it up here so much.
Yeah, Landis said, remaining seated.
It definitely speaks to me. Far more than I thought it would.
That's right. You mentioned at the luau that you hadn't spent much time near the ocean.
Landis sagged his head in mock embarrassment.
Sadly, no. My family took a trip to Lake Superior once when I was a kid, but that was as close as I'd gotten to it prior to landing in Miami last week. My folks weren't much for traveling outside our little slice of Nebraska.
Mary nodded.
I also recall you mentioning relocating somewhere more coastal. Right before my friends really interrupted us. Never did get to hear you elaborate.
Landis got to his feet and stretched his back.
Don't know. A lot of places sound good. But to me it makes the most sense to choose some place with a lot of techie jobs.
Oh yeah, you're one of those cybersecurity nerds.
Guilty as charged.
Okay, so what places are those?
Well, on the West Coast there's San Diego, San Francisco, and Seattle. You got Tampa and Miami down south, Norfolk and Savannah out east, and Honolulu way out in Hawaii.
Don't forget Vancouver and Halifax.
Sure. I always wanted to visit Australia.
No, silly, Canada.
Canada has beaches?
Yes, it has beaches. Are you...
Mary paused there and looked at him.
Oh, you're fucking with me.
Landis grinned.
Yes, I'm fucking with you. I know you're proud of your Canuck roots.
Mary pursed her lips.
You could do worse.
I'm sure.
Waving a dismissive hand his way, Mary rotated to her left, facing inland.
Anyway,
she said, nodding towards the wild vegetation that occupied most of the island's surface.
This place wouldn't be such a bad option either. You know, if it wasn't so remote, and so devoid of other people.
Landis joined her in surveying the island's lush greenery.
This is going to sound a little geeky, But did you ever watch the show Lost from the early 2000s?
I'm Canadian, not Amish.
Mary said.
Of course I watched it. Great show. Stupid ending.
That's debatable.
It isn't. But I see what you're getting at. This island resembles the one on the show. Only there aren't any mountains here. And the plants seem like they're on fucking steroids.
Landis saw what she meant. The vegetation didn't just flourish here. It raged with a hellish intensity. The massive junipers and palms looming like sleeping giants. The tangles of fern, acanthus, and ginger battling for sunlight beneath the thick canopy. The shoots of creeper and liana streaming this way and that, weaving an intricate web of leaf and vine amongst the droves of orchids, azaleas, and holly.
So this isn't normal then?
Landis said.
Wow.
Mary replied.
First ocean and first jungle?
First sunken ship, too.
Heck of a trip, huh?
Heck of a trip.
Landis noticed movement to their right and saw that some of their fellow castaways had begun to congregate in the boulder-laden clearing they used for group assemblies. With the morning shelter-building project finished and their allotted break time over, it was on to the next task that Blanchard, the cruise ship's first officer and self-appointed leader here, had dreamed up.
You a part of that?
Landis inquired. Mary regarded the gathering castaways.
Possibly. You?
Depends. You know what Blanchard has in mind?
Not sure. Although I did hear Hadley and Stevens talking about taking a raft out to where the ship went down. Blanchard seems to like the idea.
Hadley and Stevens were the ship's staff officer and chief engineer. Landis scowled.
Really? Why?
From what I heard, they want to see if someone can swim down to the wreckage and recover some things. Stevens seems to think he can do it.
That's crazy. They won't even know where to look. No one knows how far out we were, and even if they did, the ship is gone. Bottom of the ocean. Brad may seem a bit fishy, those bug eyes. What do you think, Graves' disease? But I didn't see any gills on his fucking neck.
Mary batted his arm playfully.
You're awful. There's a scuba kid on one of the lifeboats.
Even so, I just think we're better off concentrating on the food situation instead of silly errands like that.
It was no secret that food supplies were running low, and their fishing efforts had proved negligible.
If we're here a couple more days, people are going to start getting real hungry real fast.
I think everyone understands that. Hopefully we won't be here that long. Someone had to have heard Blanchard's sat phone plea.
The first of the 3 explosions that eventually sunk the ship had occurred in the communications room, taking away the crew's ability to initiate a traditional mayday. Blanchard fortunately had the presence of mind amid the ensuing chaos to grab a sat phone on his way to the bridge crew's lifeboat.
That's the hope. It would have been nice if he hadn't dropped the stupid thing in the water before getting a response, but that's the universe for you.
Indeed it is. I know he feels rotten about it, just as he feels rotten about you.
Landis peered at her.
Me?
All I know is he's mentioned you several times in the last few days, saying he doesn't get why you don't want to be a part of the team. It really seems to bug him.
Grumbling to himself, Landis edged his way to the bottom of the dune and walked back out to where the dry and wet sand converged. After the ship had gone kablooey, and they all ended up on the island, Blanchard and his boys had rapidly established a pecking order among the ship's survivors, with the boat's officers at the top, the ship workers at second tier, and the 100-plus passengers at the bottom. Landis thought it made sense and was happy being a worker bee. Blanchard, however, had other designs, and repeatedly tried to draft him into the upper echelon. When Landis resisted, Blanchard upped the pressure, going to the point of insulting him in front of the others for not being a team player.
Hey!
Mary said, catching up to Landis.
Did I say something wrong?
Landis watched as the ebon tide slid up the shore and lapped at his toes.
No. It's just they keep pestering me about it, and I wish they'd fucking stop. They're doing fine without my services. Why Blanchard even cares is beyond me.
Is it?
Huh?
Come on, Brendan,
Mary said.
Everyone knows you saved his life the night the ship went down. His life and the whole damn bridge crew's lives. That's why he cares.
Landis let out an irritated huff and ran a hand through his thick swath of black hair. She was right, of course. When the bridge crew's lifeboat came apart during the third explosion, Landis had jumped in the water and rescued the 3 officers who had survived the impact. It should have been 4 officers, but the blast had incinerated the poor captain. Taking Landis's silence as quiet acquiescence, Mary removed her white blouse and jean shorts and dropped them in the dry sand. Underneath, she had on a stunning light blue bikini that revealed a taut runner's body.
You know,
She said, heading for the water.
I think I'll go for that dip now.
So, not attending that gathering then?
They don't need me.
So saying, Mary slipped beneath the water's surface. 15 long seconds later, she came up for air and gave him a thumbs up. Returning the gesture, Landis backed up a few paces and sat down in the warm, dry sand. As he watched Mary frolic about in the sparkling blue waters, it occurred to him that he genuinely liked the woman, more than he had liked anyone in a long time. And unless he completely misread the situation, it seemed she genuinely liked him too. Interested to see where things went from here, Landis hooked his fingers behind his head and lay back, resting his head on a natural sand pillow. Before long, his eyes drooped shut, and the sound of waves sloshing carried him off to sleep.
Brendan! Wake up!
Landis opened his eyes to find Mary standing over him, kicking his foot.
Get up, sleepyhead. Something's happened.
What? He murmured. He had been dreaming of the night the ship had gone down, of the explosions, the chaos, the crazy ordeal in the water, and frenzied images still echoed in his mind. What's the matter?
The party Blanchard sent out earlier is back.
So?
Apparently they found some food. I'm going to see what's up. You should come too.
Landis rubbed his face. Fuck. All right. Mary grabbed his hand, helped him up, and stalked off towards the group. Reluctantly, Landis straggled after her, his eyes locked on her wet, shifting buttocks. So nice to have you back, Brendan, Blanchard said as Landis and Mary joined the other survivors. All done staring at the pretty ocean, are we? Maybe, Landis fired back. You all done being a dickwad? Groans and chuckles issued from the others in equal measure. Blanchard was a tall, hefty man with a large, bald head. Even without an officious uniform on to draw one's attention, he was a beacon in a crowd. He peered disapprovingly at Landis, then glanced at Stevens, who had led the team sent to explore the far side of the island. Stevens has an announcement, he said to everyone. Stevens, a skinnier Steve Buscemi type, de-shouldered the backpack he was carrying and unzipped it.
All right. So about half a mile in, we came across an acre's worth of trees with what looks like papaya growing on them.
He removed the 3 green-yellow orbs from the bag and set them on the ground. Anyone tried them? Blanchard asked.
Hey, all 4 of us.
Lou Moncrief replied. Lou worked as a bartender at the ship's ocean bar. Landis had met him the first night out. Seemed like a good enough guy.
And we're all fine.
The 2 others from the recon team nodded. Landis didn't know them by name. All right, change of plans, Blanchard announced. We'll skip getting the wreckage site for now and take about 20 people back into the jungle to collect as much of the fruit as we can. Any volunteers? Many hands went up, including Mary's. Blanchard selected 17 of them, plus Mary. What do you say? He asked Landis. Mary arched her eyebrows invitingly. Sure, Landis said. Happy to help. Wonderful, Blanchard replied. He indicated the large pile of luggage gathered under one of the shelters they had built earlier. If you please, grab a bag or 2 each and we'll get to it. The volunteers migrated to the shelter and retrieved their bags. Blanchard, Stevens, and Hadley did the same. Morgan, the hotel manager, joined them. Mary selected a military duffel bag from the heap.
Think of it as an adventure,
She told Landis.
Pretend we're on Lost.
Landis grabbed the blue suitcase and matching garment bag.
All right, he said. I can be Jack and you can be Kate.
He looked around.
But who's Locke and who's Ben?
Blanchard would be Locke for sure. Morgan would be Ben,
she whispered.
I know he's black, but with those glasses, he's a dead ringer.
Landis laughed because she was spot on.
And let's go with you being Sawyer instead of Jack. I mean, you've got Jack-like looks and everything, but you're more the Sawyer type.
She slung the duffel bag over her shoulder and headed for the others, who were already heading into the jungle. Landis grinned after her. Most of the women he knew who had watched the show found the Sawyer character sexy as hell, which he thought boded well for him. They were a quarter-mile in when they came across the first patch of blackened trees.
What the hell is this?
Said Dennis Mannon, one of the ship's musicians and owner of the biggest afro Landis had ever seen on a white dude. Stevens approached the tree and gestured towards the ring of sooty undergrowth that lay beneath them.
Yeah, we saw a bunch of this earlier. It's all over the place. Fires ignited by lightning strikes, my guess. Bound to happen out here.
Blanchard looked mildly displeased that Stevens hadn't mentioned this before. He stood next to the far skinnier man and examined the charred vegetation. Burns look fresh, except... He pointed at a series of new branches growing from the trees and the shoots of vines scaling the blackened husks. If the burns was fresh, I doubt those vines would be growing all over them. Not yet, at least. Stevens shrugged.
Storms a lot out here. Plants grow quick when they have plenty of water. Y'all should see my lawn back in Savannah after it rains a couple days.
Blanchard scrutinized the fresh growth. I suppose. Awesome, Morgan declared, kicking at the charred log. Mr. Saw, now can we get on with it?
What's the rush, sir?
Nick Hadley said.
Got you a hot date or something?
Hadley was the youngest of the hotel stewards and conducted himself as if he had been plucked straight out of the 40s, with his side-parted hair and Bogart-esque mannerisms. No, young fella, Morgan said. Getting hungry is all. A few of the others said they were getting hungry as well, and Blanchard proposed they move on. As they trundled through the underbrush, Landis noted that they were actually walking over a thick layer of soot. The bottoms of his sneakers were caked with the stuff. He made a comment about it, which Stevens dismissed as expected given the number of storms and lightning strikes the island likely took. The look on Blanchard's face suggested he thought Stevens was full of shit. When they got to the grove, an area markedly different from the palms, bamboos, and junipers filling out the rest of the jungle, Stevens raised his arms exultantly towards the tops of the new trees.
Here we are. Beautiful, aren't they? Magnificent,
Lou Moncrief agreed. The other two from the original party murmured their assent. A bare-chested volunteer who sported a head full of sandy dreads edged in for a closer look.
Yo, I ain't so sure this shit is papaya. Papayas are smaller and softer.
What is it then? Blanchard asked.
A cousin of the papaya maybe,
Dread Guy said.
You know, it's funny finding it here in the first place. Papaya is native to the Americas, not Africa or Europe. We were headed for the Mediterranean, yo, so I'm betting we're somewhere near northern Africa. I wonder what it's doing here.
Doesn't really matter much in our situation, Blanchard replied, as long as it's edible. He turned to Stevens. So, there's about an acre of this fruit?
Give or take,
said Stevens.
We walked around it before. Didn't really walk through it, though.
Blanchard's large brow furrowed. Why not? Stevens pointed at the trees.
Guess we were too focused on getting some of it down.
Blanchard looked at Morgan. Mike, do me a favor. Take Brendan and Mrs. Simmons here and check the rest of this out. Bring her duffel bag in case you find anything else. We'll fill up the rest of the bags you brought. Morgan nodded.
You bet. But first...
He picked up a felled fruit and hurled it at one of the clusters in the canopy above. The fruit struck home, knocking 3 of its brethren loose. Morgan grabbed one, pulled out a Swiss Army knife from his pocket, and signaled for Landis and Mary to follow him. As they disappeared into the papaya grove, Landis heard Blanchard ask Stevens what the hell was wrong with them. Stevens claimed he didn't know what Blanchard meant, adding that he felt great. He was just a little hungry was all, like everyone else. Landis and Mary chatted quietly as they traipsed along after Morgan. Morgan, meanwhile, wandered ahead, seemingly more concerned with nibbling his fruit than whether or not they were keeping up. He did, however, offer them a taste at one point, but both Landis and Mary declined. Landis's stomach hadn't been right since the ship had sunk, and Mary just wasn't hungry.
Suit yourselves.
Minutes onward, he strayed out of sight. Mary and Landis hurried to catch up. They found him at a dead stop, standing at the edge of a large depression in the jungle floor. The depression, more of a crater in Landis's opinion, looked to be about 100 feet wide and 20 feet deep. It was filled with a latticework of leaf and vine, beneath which lay a bunch of white sticks and shell fragments. Landis drew up to the pit's edge, knelt and studied its contents. Mary went down on her haunches beside him. "Wait," Landis said.
Are those?
Fuck me sideways, they are,
Mary confirmed. Morgan adjusted his glasses and surveyed the mounds of remains. Skulls, rib cages, femurs, pelvises.
I'm no anthropologist, but those look human to me.
The sentiment hung in the air, and the three of them gawked in stunned silence. At last Morgan spoke up, instructing Landis to go get Blanchard.
Just him, nobody else. And be cool about it here. Right now, go.
Landis turned and ran back the way they had come. He returned 10 minutes later with a sweaty, stone-faced Blanchard in tow. As they came upon the pit, Blanchard demanded to know what was going on. Morgan said nothing, just pointed. Blanchard stared into the pit for a full minute, taking it all in.
Jesus, Harold Christ. There's got to be at least, 100 of them? 200? Where'd they all come from?
An old slave ship?
Ventured Mary.
Or pirates,
Morgan said.
I feel mighty silly saying it, but it's possible that pirates from the olden days used this place as a dumping ground for their victims.
Wouldn't pirates just dump their victims at sea? Landis said. Blanchard knelt at the pit's edge.
I don't see any clothes.
Yeah,
Morgan said.
Mary and I noticed that too. It's bizarre.
That,
Mary added.
And it appears that some of the bones are way older than the others.
She pointed to a cluster at the pit's center, which seemed more weathered than the ones near the edge.
Like those? Is it me, or do they look new?
Blanchard was inclined to agree.
Could it be different groups of people?
Landis queried, not liking the implications. Blanchard stood up, closed his eyes, and began massaging the lids.
All right, listen up. I mean really listen.
He opened his eyes.
As bizarre as this is, and I grant you it's fucking bizarre, it cannot be our priority right now. When rescue comes, sure, but until that time, we have bigger fish to fry. Namely, getting everyone fed, which means we're the only four that knows about this. Understood?
Morgan nodded. Landis and Mary exchanged a dubious look, but also nodded their concurrence.
Good,
Blanchard said.
And thank you. Now, let's get back and help round up some more fruit before someone comes looking.
Landis pondered the jungle around them. There was still much of it they hadn't searched yet. He asked Blanchard if he and Mary could continue with their reconnaissance, pointing out there might be different fruit nearby, and they'd never know if they didn't look. Blanchard was reluctant, especially with what they had just found, but Landis pressed him.
I've hunted and camped with my dad since I was a little kid. This is nothing.
Blanchard sighed and glanced at his watch.
Fine. Just meet us back here at the beach in an hour. No longer.
Mary gave him a mock salute.
You got it, boss.
Blanchard turned, and he and Morgan started back towards the others.
An hour,
he said, disappearing into the lush greenery. Halfway into their allotted time, Landis and Mary came upon a small clearing in the papaya grove and opted to take a short break there.
Man, I thought for sure we'd find something cool out here,
Landis said, taking a seat on a fallen juniper.
But nothing.
A freshwater spring would have been nice.
Mary said.
The water rations from the lifeboats are nearly gone.
Landis licked his dry lips.
Amen to that, lady. It's a problem.
He looked at her and smiled.
What?
Nothing. It's just that you were right. This is like an adventure.
Mary responded with a sultry grin and approached him. While she'd put her Daisy Dukes back on prior to setting out with the group, she'd left her blouse back at the beach.
Coming to see the light, are we?
She said, drawing close. Landis remained still. His Cornhusker shorts suddenly became uncomfortable in the front.
I take it you wanted to get me alone for some reason?
She went on. Landis's mind went in 1,000 directions.
Perhaps.
Mary gently straddled him, pressing her body hard against his.
Well, somebody's excited down there.
To be honest, I've been imagining this for days.
Me too.
They leered at each other then and let their instincts take over. By Landis's watch, they had made it back to the beach in a hair over Blanchard's hour. Both were giddy about what had just happened, but took care to act normal when they emerged from the jungle. They found Stevens and Hadley sitting amongst a large group of passengers and ship workers, telling jokes and eating the gathered fruit. Everyone seemed happy and festive. Not seeing Blanchard, Landis waved at Stevens and got his attention.
Brendan,
the skinny man said.
You made it back. Anything else out there to report? Nada,
Landis said.
Oh, well, worth a shot.
Stevenson's gaze lingered on Landis a few seconds longer than it should have, making Landis wonder if the man was gay. Not that he cared. It was just a damned unusual look.
Blanchard around?
Mary asked. Stevens pointed at the shore where another large group of passengers and ship workers were milling about.
Radjic, one of the performers, made a big fuss while we were away about seeing a ship. The big guy's over there looking for it. No one else saw anything. My guess is the Czech imagined it.
Thanks, Landis said.
No prob. Have any papaya yet? Not yet, but I will. Good. You really should. It's incredible.
Stevens peered down at a stack of the untouched fruit on the ground and seemed to forget all about Landis. Landis laced his fingers in Mary's, which surprised and delighted her, and they wandered towards the shore. They found Blanchard standing with his feet in the water and his focus on the distant horizon. Morgan stood next to him, munching on the yellow-green fruit.
See anything, Dave?
Landis queried, letting go of Mary's hand. Blanchard shrugged. Doubt there's anything to see. A few meters away, a shirtless man with dark hair and a goatee kicked angrily at the water.
I saw, I tell you,
he shouted.
I know ship, and this was ship.
Blanchard inhaled and indicated the bonfire that raged about 80 yards down the beach, the signal fire they had erected shortly after washing ashore.
Nikolai, I don't know what you saw. A ship in the area would have seen the smoke from our fire and would have come to investigate. Screw you, not Captain, Radjic said. I know what I see.
Blanchard waved a dismissive hand at the performer and faced Landis, who preempted any questions by saying they hadn't found anything else. Blanchard looked relieved. He gave Landis a thumbs up and headed back towards Stevens' group.
Getting hungry again. Gonna have some more fruit.
Morgan remained where he was, eyes on the sea, papaya juice oozing down his chin. Landis and Mary joined hands once more, and Landis led her back to his favorite dune. Remounting it, they peered out at the vast glittering ocean. The waves kept rolling in from infinity, approaching and receding, approaching and receding. Slish, slosh, slish, slosh.
Okay, if we just chill for a bit and watch to see if maybe that Nikolai guy is right. Part of me hopes he is, and part of me hopes he isn't.
Sure, Landis said, knowing what she meant. He put his arm around her, and together they contemplated the island's various mysteries. Day gave way to evening, and no ship came. When it got dark, most of the 100-plus survivors migrated to the makeshift shelters they had finished building earlier. Some gathered under the tent-like canopies, while others broke into smaller clusters and erected campfires to huddle around. Here and there, papayas were eaten. Landis and Mary joined a cluster that included Lou Moncrief, 2 newlywed couples, the Elkies and the Joneses, the ship's entire dance crew, and a couple of chefs. The conversation was mostly light, with topics ranging from what life was like working on a cruise ship to expectations for the upcoming election. It drifted into serious territory when Moncrief brought up the amount of people who had died in the ship's explosions, but soon enough gravitated back to lighter fare. Eventually, Landis and Mary said their goodnights and wandered back to their dune, where they snuggled close, fooled around some, and talked about how ridiculous things had turned out. Sunken cruise ship, deserted island, odd skeleton pit, heated little romance. It was the stuff of corny novels, a tale no one would believe in 20 years. Above, 1,000,000 stars shone bright in the onyx sky. "Hey, Mary," Landis whispered as they gazed up at them.
Yes, Brendan?
I'm glad random chance put us on the same cruise ship.
Crazily enough, I'm glad too.
He kissed her on the lips, and together they drifted off to sleep. They woke to the sound of a man shouting. It was Nikolai Radjic. He was on the shore again, pointing at the horizon.
I tell you! See?
Landis and Mary sat up in unison. Dozens of others had already wandered to the beach to see what the ruckus was about. They all had their eyes on the object that had Radjic in a frenzy. A large gray ship idling half a mile from shore. Soon everyone was on the beach, gawking at the vessel. Radjic sought Blanchard out and clapped in the big man's face.
See?
He said.
Is a ship.
Blanchard, who was actually stripped down to his tighty-whities, with his paunch hanging over the brief's waistband, put his hands on his wide hips and frowned.
Can you tell what it is?
He said. No flag. Portuguese, maybe. He let out a strange laugh.
But see those giant barrels jutting from the starboard side? I think it's a warship.
Landis squinted and saw that he was right.
Must have been the first to respond to the distress call,
Blanchard added. He laughed again and scratched at his chest, which was already reddened from the previous scratching.
I wonder if they've got any food.
Landis glanced around at the crowd and discerned that 3/4 of the others were stripped down to their skivvies as well. Some were fully naked, their genitals out for everyone to see, but none of them seemed to care. In fact, the only ones who appeared to notice the widespread nudity were those like Landis and Mary, who still had the majority of their clothes on.
Why are they acting like we're at hedonism too?
Mary asked.
No idea,
Landis said. It dawned on him that all those who'd stripped down were also scratching at themselves as Blanchard was. They were twitching too, like an army of drug addicts going through withdrawal. Upon hearing Blanchard's mention of food, the unclothed scratchers grew restless, uselessly reaching out for the distant ship, beseeching it to bring them sustenance. A knot formed in Landis's stomach. This was bad. Mary approached one of the female dancers they had sat with the night before, Cheryl, a short-haired bony waif who wore only her panties. She reached out and touched the woman's back. It was hot.
My God, Cheryl, you're burning up.
The dancer giggled.
I could go for a burger right about now. A nice juicy Angus burger. You think they have burgers on that boat out there? I don't know, honey,
Mary said, looking at Landis.
Hopefully. 'Cause I could eat about 10 of them, I think. 10, 11, 12.
Landis went over to Blanchard and put his hand on the man's arm. It was radiating with fever heat. Not taking his eyes off the boat, Blanchard said,
Hey, buddy, you see the ship? You see it there? A ship came after all.
He sounded high.
Yeah,
Landis said.
Pretty exciting.
Only if they had food. And why wouldn't they?
Landis squeezed Blanchard's warm shoulder, then trotted back to the shore and motioned for Mary to come with him to the water, where they both rinsed their hands.
What are we doing?
Mary asked.
They're sick,
Landis said, keeping his voice down.
It looks serious. Come on.
Together they hurried over to where the shelter stood. Remnants of snacked-upon papayas were scattered everywhere.
Maybe it's the fruit,
Landis said. Mary deliberated what he was saying.
You think it's toxic?
Or infected with some sort of bug. In college, I studied microbiology as a minor and learned a little about bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. That crap can get into just about anything, fruit included. Usually you see signs of the infection in the fruit, but not always.
So this is like a mega potent form of food poisoning or something?
Or something.
3 of the clothed non-scratchers spotted Landis and Mary and broke away from the beach. 2 men and a woman. Landis didn't know their names.
Hey, guys,
the first man said, jogging towards them. He was older with silver hair and a George Hamilton tan.
I think there might be a problem with the papaya.
The second man, who was much younger than the first, and who seemed betrothed to the woman with them, said,
People who ate it ain't acting right. Look, they're all naked.
We didn't eat any,
the woman said.
Did you?
No.
Landis and Mary replied in unison. A loud collective cry of pain erupted then from the mouths of all the scratchers. When it stopped, every one of them collapsed to the sand. Left standing there were a dozen more fully clothed non-scratchers, others like them who Landis deduced had not touched the tainted fruit. Half of the dozen, out of confusion and fear, fled to where Landis's group stood. The other 6 began tending to the fallen, endeavoring to stir them. Landis ran over to see if he could help.
They breathing?
He asked one of those who had stayed, a man recognized as one of the casino's card dealers.
Are their hearts beating?
Casino guy looked up at Landis.
Yes to both. They're hot as hell, but they seem okay, just unconscious. Dude, any idea what did this?
Landis relayed the bad fruit theory to him. The guy mulled it over and let out an empty laugh.
Huh. Of all the tropical islands in the ocean, we wash up on the one with the fucked up papaya.
And the pit full of human skeletons,
Landis said.
What?
Casino guy said. Landis filled them in on their grim discovery.
Good heavens! Where the fuck are we?
Wish I knew.
Landis transferred his gaze to the ominous ship. Though it was hard to tell from this distance, he believed he detected activity on deck. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad. A wet slapping sound brought his attention back to the beach. He saw that all the fallen bodies were now convulsing and flopping around like fish in the sand. White foam frothed from their mouths, and a low staccato keening noise emanated from their throats. Casino guy cried out in fright and jumped back. Landis retreated to the shelters and took Mary's hand. Casino guy and the 5 others who had been tending to the bodies followed suit. Questions abounded as to what to do, and the only thing any of them felt comfortable with was waiting and seeing. The convulsions went on for 2 or more minutes before abruptly stopping.
Should we go and see if they're okay?
Before anyone could answer, a number of the fallen sat up. The rest also moved, but in strange ways. Some rolled onto their bellies. Some lifted a leg or an arm, or both, as if experimenting with their use. The ones who sat up started doing the same. Landis noted that all of them had their eyes open and that their expressions were either slack or twitchy. Ignoring the sheer bizarreness of this development, the red-haired woman bounded over to the spastic bodies. She knelt next to a teenage girl who had no clothes on. The girl was sitting up and staring blankly ahead. Red Hair asked her something, and the girl's head jerked towards her. To Landis, the girl's eyes looked devoid of life. Contradicting this, the girl smiled at Red Hair, or rather, her lips peeled back, exposing her teeth. At the same time, one of her arms flailed up and its claw-like hand seized hold of Red Hair's locks. Red Hair asked the girl what she was doing. The girl responded by biting into Red Hair's face and pulling away a sizable chunk of her right cheek. Blood sprang from the wound and the poor woman screamed. Casino Guy was the first to react, sprinting over to Red Hair and attempting to pry the naked teen's arm away. The girl wouldn't let go, so he punched her in the face. The blow knocked the girl back, causing her to rip a large tuft from Red Hair's head. Red Hair screamed again. Casino Guy hauled the bleeding woman to her feet and hurried her back to the others. Landis removed his shirt and pressed it against her ruined face. Across the beach, the rest of the fallen started to rise. By degrees, they got onto their hands and knees before elevating onto shaky legs. Several stumbled and fell as they rose, but in time they all managed to stand. Once upright, they turned their sights on each other. An eerie moment followed where they all appeared to size each other up. Then pandemonium erupted. Everyone attacked everyone. It was like one of those massive WWE Royal Rumbles, except the violence was real. Biting seemed the most prevalent form of attack, with teeth tearing at flesh everywhere you looked. Blood spurted in rivers. Tanned older guys scurried into the jungle and signaled for the rest of the non-fruit eaters to join him. Landis believed it was the wisest move and ushered 26 of them into the trees.
Why the hell are they killing each other?
Mary asked frantically.
Whatever infected them turned them rabid,
Landis said. Red Hair released a loud moan.
My face! That fucking bitch!
Landis told her to hush, believing it crucial for them to stay off the fruit eater's radar. He passed this notion on to the others and they all concurred. None of them wanted to end up like Red Hair. Hidden within a thicket of palm leaves, they watched in horror as the fruit eaters went at each other like starved animals, inflicting gruesome wounds. Here and there, Landis saw a penis bitten off or a breast torn away, but it was the faces that seemed to take the worst punishment. After a few minutes, there wasn't a fruit eater out there that didn't have at least some portion of their countenance removed. Blanchard, who bore a myriad of red gashes, no longer had a nose or ears. Not that it fazed him at all. He was going through the other fruit eaters like a wrecking ball, plucking muscle and skin off passing bodies as if they were rotisserie chickens.
Why aren't any of them going down?
Tan Guy asked. It was a damn good question, thought Landis. The damage most of them had suffered was more than enough to put a normal person out of commission for months. Yet there they all stood, battered and bloodied, but still ticking like ghastly Energizer bunnies.
We got to get out of here,
Casino Guy said.
No fucking shit,
Landis said.
But where? The lifeboats,
Tan Guy declared.
We could hop on a couple and head out to that ship.
Landis considered the suggestion. The 4 surviving lifeboats were anchored just offshore, beyond where the signal fire burned. They were secured by long ropes tying them to trees in the jungle. He imagined it wouldn't be too hard to swim out to them, get them started. After that, he wasn't so sure motoring out to the warship was the best plan. The fact it hadn't moved any closer troubled him. Landis communicated this to the others.
Who cares?
The Tan Guy said.
Look, I get it's a mean-looking boat with guns and shit, but so what? It's not like they're going to shoot a bunch of tourists.
A number of the others murmured in agreement.
Okay,
Landis said, wholly unsure that being a tourist offered them any sort of armor.
It's the best we got. Let's do it then.
They crept through the jungle, making as little noise as possible. Red Hair kept Landis's shirt pressed to her face and stuffed a clump of it into her mouth to muffle her cries. When they reached the signal fire, they discussed who would get on what boat and who would drive. There'd be one group of 12, one group of 13. Both groups would swim out at the same time in case their presence drew the fruit eaters.
Ready, everyone?
Tan Guy said. They all nodded. He counted to 3 and they went. The fruit eaters immediately took notice and came shambling up the shoreline. Their movements were stiff and they seemed unaware of how to run. Landis's group had already made it to their lifeboat by the time the bloody horde reached a signal fire. Curiously, none of the fruit eaters pursued them into the water. They just stood on the shore staring, a collective bloody mess, littered with oozing wounds, open fractures, and mutilated flesh. Some were still chewing on things.
They're just standing there.
"Fine with me," Landis replied. Tanguy led the other group. His 12 boarded their boat faster than Landis's people and quickly got their engine running. Landis told them to go on ahead. They'd be along in a minute. Tanguy concurred and set off towards the warship. A scraggly bearded guy named Ellis volunteered to run Landis's boat. It took a few tries, but the old-timer finally got the motor to kick on. As he backed the boat up to turn it, Mary went to the starboard side and watched Tanguy's lifeboat. It was already a quarter of the way to the warship. Landis watched with her. After a few seconds, he tensed up and grabbed her arm.
"Christ, Mary, look at the ship."
One of the vessel's turrets rotated toward Tanguy's lifeboat and leveled off its 2 large barrels. A heartbeat later, and Tanguy's lifeboat exploded into 1,000,000 pieces. Ellis cursed and banked their boat hard left.
They killed them!
Mary yelled. Landis saw that the smoking turret was changing direction, aiming for their boat. He yelled for Ellis to go as fast as they could.
"Yeah, what the fuck do you think I'm doing?"
Ellis yelled back. The guns fixed on them. Landis's heart froze. He wondered if being blown apart would hurt. Seconds passed, then a few more, but no whomp came.
What are they waiting for?
Red Hair murmured, pus dribbling down her chin. As if in reply, the sound of propellers roared above them. Landis looked up and saw what looked like a small military transport plane flying overhead. He darted to the port side of the lifeboat and tracked the aircraft as it hurtled off into the distance, then curled back toward the island. When it reached the island, its cargo bay door opened, and a gel-like liquid poured from the opening, raining down on the jungle. It was a nasty-smelling substance, its petrol odor powerful enough to burn Landis's nostrils. Once the transport plane finished dumping its payload, it veered off to the east. It did not make another pass. Landis's boat had somehow reached the nearest end of the island. It appeared they had diverted blowing up long enough to escape. As Landis thought this, however, he heard another loud thwomp. He had expected to feel the force of a mighty blast, but instead a tall arc of fire leapt up from the center of the jungle, and the island's core burst into flames. Landis peered at the beach and saw that the fruit eaters were shambling along the shoreline after his boat, their bodies ablaze.
"The ship people knew about the fruit,"
Landis muttered. Mary clung to his arm.
Are we going to end up like the others?
Landis glanced back at the warship. Its turret had not followed them.
"I don't know."
Mary nuzzled in close and wept. Landis wept with her. Behind them, Red Hair collapsed to the floor and started convulsing. The captain of the Moroccan destroyer stood within the ship's conning tower, his binoculars trained on the escaping lifeboat. He felt terrible for the people aboard. He hated what he had already done to their companions and what he was further compelled to do to them. They knew it was bacteria-based, what festered inside the fruit, and that the fruit looked and tasted like papaya, but technically wasn't. They also knew the trees upon which the fruit grew were resilient beyond comprehension. No matter what chemical they used, it always grew back. What they didn't know, because it was strict policy not to remove any samples from the island, was how to treat against the infection once it entered a host. It was the captain's charge to make sure they never had to find out. It was also his charge to make sure the rest of the world remained oblivious to its existence. Since the late 1600s, when the island was first discovered, it had been upon an Alawite descendant's shoulders to keep the place a secret. Thus far, every one of them had succeeded. The captain had no intention of being the first to fail. After a moment of contemplation, he lowered his binoculars and nodded to his executive officer. The executive lifted his handheld communicator and gave the order. Send a team, no survivors. The amphibious raft sped away from the warship and rounded the end of the island in pursuit of Landis's lifeboat. The team manning the raft spotted the lifeboat immediately. It sat not even 100 meters offshore, and it was barely moving, as if the engine had stalled. The officer leading the strike team directed the navigator to make the standard approach, 30 meters from the stern, all weapons hot. The navigator positioned the raft as instructed. The officer surveyed the boat but saw no sign of the passengers. Assuming they were hiding on the floor, he commanded his team to open fire. The team first riddled the lifeboat with small arms fire, then pummeled it with the grenade launchers. When they were done, very little remained of the boat. The strike team maintained their position for several minutes after the last bits of the lifeboat vanished beneath the surface. Satisfied no one had survived, the lead officer signaled to the navigator to turn the raft around and to return to their ship. Before the navigator could act, however, a woman-like creature with red hair sprang up from the water and crawled onto the raft. Its mouth latched onto one of the men's legs. The officer pulled out his .45 and shot the creature in the neck. The bullet had no effect. The creature lunged at a different man and caught his arm in its mouth. The officer fired again. The 12 from Landis's boat lay close to the shore with their bodies immersed in ocean and their heads barely poking out of the water. It had been Landis's idea to abandon the boat and swim back to the island once they were out of sight, hoping the boat would work as a decoy. An idea made easier once Red Hair turned rabid and attacked their group. It seemed the infection propagated at a highly accelerated rate if transmitted via a bite. Casino Guy got it worst. She had eaten his face and voice box and left him there to suffer in silent agony. From their half-hidden positions, they watched in horror as the strike team unleashed its assault on their lifeboat. As the vessel came apart at the seams, Landis looked at Mary and told her he was happy they got to enjoy their little adventure together.
"It's more than some people get,"
Mary said, and kissed him with her bloodied lips. When they looked at the sea again, the people on the amphibious raft were being attacked by something that had emerged from the water. Shots rang out. Screams traveled through the air. Landis wondered what had happened, but soon realized Red Hair must have made it to the raft. The vindictive part of him was glad.
"Do you think whoever bombed the cruise ship knew about this place?"
Mary asked.
"Do you think they wanted to expose it to the world?"
"Or expose the world to it," Landis said darkly.
"Motherfuck!"
Ellis exclaimed, peering to their left.
"What?"
Landis asked. The sound had barely registered when the amphibious raft exploded. Landis turned his head and saw the warship rounding the south end of the island. It was much closer now. He could see people standing on the deck holding binoculars. Some pointed at the exploded raft, others at their group. Their not-so-well-hidden group, he thought. He saw the turret with the barrels take aim at them, too. He looked at his left hand, which was missing the pinky and ring finger. He could already feel the microbes going to work on him. He was already itchy and craving meat. Lots and lots of meat. "It's for the best, Mary," he said, understanding the warship's purpose. "It's for the..."
Squirrels. Linus spat the word like a curse as he hauled himself out of his recliner. His ungainly exit bumped the end table, spilling his nearly empty beer can to the floor. Linus snatched it up, mopping at the puddle with his socked foot. The scratching noise below him continued unabated. Every year in the spring, squirrels got into his basement. He had no idea where or how. He had sealed the foundation with concrete, sprayed hardening foam insulation around all the windows. There were no gaps he could see, no drains or large pipes leading in or out. And yet, each spring, he would start hearing scratching noises from beneath the floor. It wasn't even like it was the same ones coming back. The rat traps he set made sure of that. All squirrels just seemed to believe that Linus's basement was a fantastic spring break getaway. Linus had considered posting the dead bodies of the previous squirrels who'd tried to move in as a warning to the others, but he figured that his neighbors would probably complain about that sort of yard decoration. Linus peeled off his damp sock and draped it over the arm of the chair to dry. One sock still on, he stomped toward the basement, hoping his footsteps would scare the squirrels away. He'd still have to set the traps, of course, but at least he wouldn't have to deal with a squirrel panicking and trying to escape into the house. The scratching was still going strong when he opened the basement door. Linus paused before turning on the light. It didn't actually sound much like the squirrels. Squirrels made a frantic scritch, scritch, scritch of tiny claws tearing rapidly against wood, or a shuff, shuff, shuff of small bodies burrowing into insulation. This noise was longer and sharper than either of those. It put Linus in mind of a knife being sharpened against a whetstone, a drawn-out shunk, shunk. It felt like the noise something bigger than a squirrel would make. What if a bear got in somehow? Linus wondered, his hand hovering by the light switch. Even in his slightly inebriated state, he immediately dismissed that idea. If there was a hole big enough to admit a bear to his house, he would have noticed it. Still, maybe a badger? An opossum? Aren't there supposed to be coyotes in this area now? The logical side of Linus's brain told him that he was being ridiculous, but it was rapidly being shouted down by much more vocal sections. Feeling absurd, Linus carefully closed the basement door and quietly walked to the hall closet. He felt around on the top shelf and pulled down a shoebox, which he opened to reveal a handgun and 2 clips of ammunition. He loaded the pistol and, holding it firmly in front of him, returned to the basement door. Linus took several deep, steadying breaths as he eased the basement door open. The scratching continued, telling him that whatever animal it was still hard at work. He aimed his pistol toward the approximate source of the noise and, reaching across with his left hand, flipped on the light. The gun fired once immediately as Linus clenched the trigger in shock. In the corner of the basement, barely visible from the top of the stairs, crouched a creature from a nightmare. Its skin was a mottled gray, viscous, like a slug. 4 tattered wings drooped from its back, shreds of tendons and skin hanging from damaged bones and bloody curtains. Its hands were bladed and jagged-edged, the stubby fingers tipped with terrifying claws that it had been using to tear into the cement floor of Linus's unfinished basement. Startled by the light and the wild gunshot, the creature whirled to face Linus. Its body was humanoid but horribly gaunt, every rib visible beneath its taut, slimy skin. Horrible though its body was, its face was worse. It looked vaguely human, a tumultuous parody scratched out by a madman, but its mouth was a slaughterhouse of serrated teeth, protruding forward in a blunt muzzle. Its nose folded into the muzzle, mere flaring slits testing the air, and its compound eyes glittered in dark sockets, each socket holding a cluster of dark, unblinking orbs, nestled together like spider eggs. The creature hissed at Linus, baring its fangs. Linus wanted desperately to run, but if this thing could dig through concrete, his hollow-core wooden door wouldn't even stop it for a second. With adrenaline surging through his body, he focused his trembling hand and fired for center mass, emptying his clip. Training in close range won out over shaking hands. The creature dropped, its chest in ichorous ruin. It snapped its muzzle twice vaguely as it fell, then laid still. Linus stood at the top of the stairs, eyes wide, heart thundering, afraid to move. He watched the creature for a full minute, convinced it was going to get back up. But as the black puddle beneath it spread wider and wider, Linus slowly began to believe it was dead. He stared for another few seconds, working up the courage to move, and then ran for the hall closet. He fumbled the shoebox from the shelf, knocking it to the ground and spilling his spare clip to the floor. Cursing, he snatched it up, loaded it into the gun, and ran back for the basement stairs. The creature was still there, still unmoving. With extreme caution, his eyes never leaving the body, Linus slowly descended the staircase. When he reached the final step, the creature's body was no more than 10 feet away from him. Linus leaned his arm on the railing, steadying his shot, and aimed carefully at the creature's head. Only after he had fired the entire second clip into its skull did he finally step down onto the basement floor and approach the body. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying. Linus examined it with awe, simultaneously fascinated and repulsed. What was this thing? How had it gotten into his basement? And what had it been doing there? The first two questions had no clear answers, but the third one seemed obvious. There was a hole a half-foot deep in the basement floor near the corner, dug away by the creature's powerful claws. Linus stepped gingerly past the body and peered into the hole. It looked like it had torn entirely through the concrete slab to get at something. At the bottom of the hole, something metallic glittered. Linus reached carefully past the jagged concrete remnants and withdrew a slim metal box. It looked like some sort of document tray, the weatherproof kind used to store important papers. A small lock on the front held the box shut, but its contents rattled slightly when the box was moved, so Linus was certain it wasn't empty. As his adrenaline slowly drained away, curiosity began to take its place. What was this box buried in his basement? How had the creature known it was there? How had the creature gotten in? And for that matter, what on earth was it in the first place? Linus carried the box upstairs, stepping warily past the monster's remains again. He sat at his kitchen table and thought, drumming his fingers gently against the box as he did so. He couldn't call the police. The situation was too insane, possibly literally so. Linus couldn't discount the possibility that he was actually hallucinating. That would be bad enough if the police arrived and found that he had imagined the whole thing. But what if they arrived and everything was exactly as he'd thought, except that the monster was just a person? "I panicked and shot him," was a tough sell when you also had to include, "Then I left, got another clip, came back and shot him with all that one too." Besides, even if the police came and saw the monster exactly as he did, they would definitely ask if anything had been in the hole it was digging. Then Linus would either have to lie to them or surrender the box, neither of which he particularly wanted to do. Whatever was in the box was clearly something valuable, and Linus wanted to know what it was. He didn't have the key, of course, but he did have the next best thing: bolt cutters. A quick snip left the lock in 2 pieces on his table, and the box lid swung smoothly open. Inside was a single object: a book. It was bound in black leather and tied shut with a black silk ribbon. Its cover was braided with 3 interlocking circles arranged in a triangle, 2 circles on the bottom, 1 on top. Linus picked it up and turned it carefully over in his hands. The book gave the impression of both craftsmanship and age. Its cover was still supple but showing cracks in places, and the edges of the pages were yellowed. The ribbon was unfrayed, however, and when Linus untied it and opened the book, the ink on the vellum pages was rich and unfaded. The text itself was unsettling. The symbols were completely foreign, like no language Linus had ever seen before. Despite that, he had a distinct sense that he knew how to read them, or could know if he simply desired it. The book throbbed with knowledge, eager to share what it knew. As he flipped through the pages, Linus found his lips starting to form strange syllables without any real volition on his part. He clamped his lips together and firmly closed the book. Even with the cover shut, the symbols Linus had seen danced in his head, taunting him, daring him to speak them aloud. He pressed his hands to the table and shook his head, trying to will away the alien words in his mind. The book's cover caught his attention, its design of linked rings appealingly simple after the complicated knots of the symbols within. Linus reached out and traced his index finger around the ring on the bottom right, looping gently around its curve. This, he understood without knowing how, was how he could access the book. A simple commitment of blood, and he and the book would become bonded. A mere drop was all it would take. Such an easy thing to do. Such a small sacrifice to make. Such intense power to be gained. Linus forced his gaze away from the book. He placed it back in its box and firmly closed the lid. He put the symbols out of his mind and took out his phone to call the police. To his startlement, Linus found that his hand held not his phone, but the black leather book. He was not dialing, but instead lightly tracing the power circles once more. And, with the book once again in his hand, its siren call sang even more sweetly in his mind. I should go upstairs, Linus thought as he picked up the sharp-edged metal he had cut from the lock. I should just walk away, go to sleep, deal with this in the morning, he told himself as he slashed the edge against his index finger and watched the blood well up. Curiosity killed the cat, he thought. For a moment he hesitated, then pressed his bleeding finger against the book's cover. The blood flowed rapidly around the circle. The book thirstily drank it in. It took only seconds for the ring to fill in, the crimson of the blood barely visible against the book's black cover. 24 hours later, Linus knew. That was how long it would take the book to accept his blood fully, to allow him access to its secrets. Just one day until he would be able to understand everything it had to offer. But satisfaction brought it back, he said out loud, holding the book in both hands. This time, when he put it into its box, it went quietly. They were connected now. The next evening arrived. Linus held the book in his hands, savoring the power he could feel inside of it. It was still closed, for the 24 hours were not quite up, and the words within not yet his to speak. Linus knew to the second when the book would fully yield its secrets to him. Could feel the countdown pulsing in his body like a second heart. He stroked the book, running his fingers along the edge of the binding, tracing his fingernail around the embossed rings on the cover. He fantasized about what he could do with the power it contained. The exact form was still a mystery to him, but his dreams had been full of promises of wealth, of power, of wishes granted. Linus never doubted for an instant that the book would deliver all of this and more, and he could barely wait to see how it would provide. The last minute counted down. The pulse grew stronger with each beat, until, as the final second arrived, it suffused Linus's entire body. His skin tingled. He felt as if for the first time in his life, he was truly awake. Carefully, reverently, he opened the book. The symbols which had seemed so alien yesterday now leapt out at him, eager to share their information. Each page was titled with one large character, unlike any written language Linus had ever seen before. Though the hand-drawn lines were simple and clean, the symbols gave the impression of depth and three-dimensionality. They felt somehow more real than the room around them, weightier and more solid. Linus flipped slowly through the book, reading the header characters. Contain, fetch, know, erase, alter, overlook, redeem, reveal, obey. Dozens of words, the explanation of each spilling over pages and pages. But even just reading the titles flooded his mind with information. Linus was bombarded with quick snippets of what each word could do, what changes it could impose on reality. It was too much. His head throbbed, not in anticipation as with the pulse, but in pain. His skull felt like an overstuffed suitcase that someone was jamming down and trying to zip closed. And there was still more in the book. More power, more knowledge, all jostling for position. With a cry, Linus slammed the book shut. His head ached. His face was wet. He gingerly pressed his fingertips to his cheeks and was relieved to see that the liquid was only tears, not blood. Even closed, the book still yearned, promised, cajoled. Linus drummed his fingers restlessly on the book's cover, unwilling to relinquish physical contact despite the splitting pain in his head. Reading a large portion of the book at once had clearly been a mistake. Linus resolved to pop several aspirin, lie down in a dark room, and sleep off the headache. The book would be here when he awoke, and he would not duplicate his mistake of trying to comprehend it all at once. 4 pills and a glass of water later, Linus laid down on the couch to shut his eyes. He reached up to fluff the pillow under his head, only to wrap his knuckles on something flat, hard, and solid. Frowning, Linus sat up and moved the pillow. Beneath it lay the book, its dark leather cover standing out like a hole against the yellow fabric of the couch. The 3 rings seemed to stare back at Linus, challenging him. They wanted him to complete the joining. They wanted him to acquire the knowledge. They wanted him to become more. "Fine," said Linus, tapping the center of the ring he had marked with his blood. His head was already feeling better. He would risk 1 page. Fine. He flipped the book open almost at random, landing on a page labeled Alter. He preemptively winced, expecting his head to hurt, but everything felt fine. He cautiously read onward, the symbols translating themselves in his brain as if he were fluent. The ritual seemed fairly simple. The altar rune had to be drawn in precisely the correct fashion. But, complex though it was, Linus couldn't imagine ever drawing it the wrong way. The symbols were so perfectly clear and correct that having once seen them, it felt like they could never be forgotten. Linus again found himself thinking that the contents of the book were simply more present than the rest of reality, more fundamental. His headache forgotten, Linus took a cushion from the couch as a test object for the ritual and set off in search of something to write with. A minute's worth of searching through drawers yielded a thick black marker, and, with careful strokes, Linus drew the curves, angles, and intersecting lines of altar across the face of the pillow. The book's instructions said that it was the focus and intent that mattered for altar, that would inform the new shape the item was to take. It also cautioned that altar, as its name implied, neither added nor subtracted. Anything it created was drawn from the manipulated item. Reality could only be stretched so thin. Everything had a cost. As Linus drew, he focused on the idea of the pillow shifting color. It would be a clear and immediate result, and shouldn't run afoul of the spell's limitation or changing the amount of material. A simple test, and therefore, a good way to start. It never occurred to Linus that the ritual might not work. Nothing about the book allowed for that sort of doubt. His only point of curiosity was how exactly it would work. Would there be a shimmer in the air? Some sort of light or sound? Would there be heat? A flash? Brimstone? None of these happened when Linus completed the rune. He stared at the purple pillow nonplussed. Oh, maybe it takes a minute to do anything, he wondered, doubt beginning to creep in at last. A thought tugged at Linus's mind as he waited for the spell to take effect. He carried the purple pillow back into the den. The couch was yellow. All of its pillows were yellow, and now that Linus thought about it, obviously the pillow he had taken from it had been yellow, but he had been picturing it purple, and Alter had made it so. It had done it so thoroughly and unobtrusively that Linus had not even realized it had happened. Linus grinned, tossing the mismatched pillow onto the couch. Time to find out how much this ritual could do. In short order, Linus had an answer to his question and a set of badly mismatched couch pillows. One was nearly twice its original size, and although it was definitely thinner and less cushioned than the others, Alter had managed to press the existing material into service. One had a bladed edge, sharp enough to cut the other pillows, and one was no longer a pillow at all, but a pile of several dozen small gold coins. It was this last that made Linus whoop with joy. As best as he could tell from his quick internet research, assuming Alter had made real pure gold, those little discs were worth about $1,500 apiece. He had just turned a couch pillow into $75,000 worth of gold. Obviously, you're not going to get full market price from any shop, Linus told himself, trying unsuccessfully to temper his enthusiasm. Still, $50K maybe? Not bad for a pillow. Although it was nearly midnight, Linus still checked the operating hours of several nearby cash-for-gold stores just in case. As expected, they were long since closed. Linus reluctantly admitted that he should probably turn in for the night as well. He set the heavy coins aside and turned toward the bedroom. But his eye was caught by the book, propped up on the arm of the couch. Read a little more, it seemed to say to him. Learn another trick or two. Linus shook his head, slowly at first, then firmly, remembering the earlier explosion of pain in his head. No, slow and steady. He turned again for the bedroom, then hesitated. Without being completely sure why he was doing it, he returned to the couch, picked up the book, and carried it with him to bed. He laid it on the bedside table. Its cover reflected the light from the small lamp, capturing it as a bright spot in the middle of one of the interlocking circles. I'll learn all your secrets soon, said Linus, patting the book. Soon. He turned out the light and settled down to sleep, already dreaming about everything he was going to buy with his newfound wealth. $9,500. What? You've got to be kidding me. The man behind the cash for gold counter did not look like he was kidding. In fact, the look he gave Linus was one of someone who had seen far too many people try to pull one over on him, and who was thoroughly sick of it. Look, he said, chewing heavily on his gum. It's the price I'm offering. Take it or leave it. But they're worth 10 times that much. Yeah, then go sell them to whoever's gonna pay you 10 times as much. I won't hold it against you. I would do the same. I mean, I don't exactly, Linus started. It's just the price of gold. Sure, if it's pure. And yeah, the man raised a hand to forestall Linus's complaints. It tests out okay, though I gotta say, you are awfully sure that this was gonna be pure gold, considering that you just found these coins in your basement. The man's tone made it extremely clear how much truth he believed that statement to contain. I did find them in my basement, Linus exclaimed hotly. He had been proud of that story. It felt like it had the ring of truth, since, after all, he sort of had found them in his basement. There was just also an extra step involved, that was all. The man looked unimpressed. Yeah, no, obviously, lots of folks got pirate treasure under their houses. Look, I'm not interested in arguing about this. You say you found them under your house. You found them under your house. Good for you. Quite a windfall. Take your $9,500 and be happy. That's absolute highway robbery. You're taking 90% cut? Yeah, and I'm taking 100% of the risk. What risk? The man scrutinized Linus, his eyes narrowing slightly. The risk of what this gold is and who's going to come looking for it. There's never been a coin stamped that didn't have a mark of some kind on it. But somehow, you got 50 of them, featureless as washes. So that says to me that these got melted down. And I gotta ask myself what was wrong. Or maybe identifiable. about the form they was in before. Now, if I keep the sale under 10 grand, I don't have to report it to the IRS. And I'm thinking in this situation that that's probably a good thing for both of us. So, you walk away with $9,500 and this gold becomes my problem. Wait, said Linus. You have to report sales over $10,000 to the IRS? Sure do, and that goes the same for multiple sales totaling 10 grand at the same day. Plus, banks will look for suspicious patterns of deposits and withdrawals that might indicate money laundering, just in case you're thinking about trying to spread this out across a bunch of different shops. He grinned unpleasantly. Linus stood there thinking. The man behind the counter began to stack up the coins. Look, said Linus desperately, I'll sell you 10 of the coins for that. It's still a good deal for you. The man shook his head. No deal. I know you got all of these, and frankly, I don't think you're in a position to get rid of them. So, I think you need me. Like I said before, you got my offer. Take it or leave it. You want this $9,500 or what? Nah, forget it. Linus swept the coins back into the cardboard box he'd brought them in. Forget it. Good luck with your treasure, the man called after him as Linus stomped angrily out the door. In the parking lot, Linus stewed in his car for a minute, considering his options. There were other gold-buying stores in town, pawn shops too. He could take the coins to them, show them only a few coins instead of all 50, maybe get a decent deal. It would take longer. He'd have to hit up a few places, do a little more driving. But he'd come away with a lot more than $10K for his troubles. That was worth a little legwork. To Linus's dismay, no shop was willing to offer him more than $300 per coin. He brought 10 into the next shop and was offered a total of $3,000, which he turned down. Sure, he could get a better deal. The buyer in the next business looked at the 5 coins Linus presented him and offered a paltry $12.50, worse than the previous one. Linus didn't even deign to argue this time. He simply scooped up his coins and indignantly stormed out. I could go to 2,000, the man called, astonished at Linus's extreme reaction, but the door was already closing behind him. Linus flung the box of coins into his car, frustrated. How could it possibly be this hard to trade gold for money? Gold was supposed to be the universal currency. He tried to think of something else he could sell, but his thoughts just bounced around various commodities. Silver, copper, diamonds. There was no reason to believe that any of them would be any easier to offload than gold. Linus felt lied to, almost betrayed. His thoughts strayed back to the book. Surely it had a better answer for him. He'd only really read one page, and it had hundreds. A word flashed into his mind, not an English word, but one of the book's weighty symbols. Fetch. Linus said the word out loud, experimentally. The car dashboard pulsed, rippling like water, and Linus's ears popped. His throat hurt afterward, and his jaw ached as if he'd been grinding his teeth all night. Beyond that, though, the word had no visible effect. It did do one thing for Linus, though. It solidified in his mind that returning to the book was the best step to take next. Just the utterance of the word fetch, with no knowledge of how to perform the ritual at all, had warped the world for a moment. This felt stronger than alter, and if it did what Linus believed, it would turn out to be significantly more useful too. He hastened home and hurried inside, the useless gold coins forgotten in the car. Fetch would bring him what he needed. Fetch would sidestep all of the problems that had been thrown at him today. Fetch was the answer he needed. The book was waiting for him on his bedside table. When Linus picked it up, it fell open almost immediately to the correct page, as if it had been anticipating his desires. The instructions for fetch were much longer than the one-page explanation of alter, and more thorough as well. In the end, though, the process was similar. The presence of the symbol, combined with the will to focus it, created the effect. Fetch opened a small window to whatever was desired. Most of the instructions were either guidelines on clarity of thought or various warnings regarding retrieval, duration, and other limitations of the fetch portal. Linus read the pages impatiently, then set the book aside, eager to try it out for himself. He cleared his mind and focused on what he'd been attempting to get all day. Money. Bundles of cash wrapped in those little paper bands announcing the denomination of the bills inside, like in the movies. Unattended, Linus thought. Unnoticed. He pictured it as clearly as he could, and then drew the symbol for fetch in the air in front of him. His hands danced through the motions as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. The air shimmered, thrummed with intensity. When Linus drew his fingers through the final motions, sweeping them around to meet in a circle, his fingertips sliced open the space in front of him like a razor through cloth. Thin air fell away in a circle, revealing a shrink-wrapped pallet in some sort of dark room. It gave the impression of being large, even cavernous, but Linus barely noticed. He had eyes only for what could be seen beneath the plastic wrap. Money. Bound stacks of bills, exactly as he had envisioned. Linus reached through the hole in the air and tore at the thick plastic with his fingers. The angle was awkward, and Linus was wary of getting his head too close to the edge of the portal, which the book had cautioned against. After a few minutes, though, he had torn away enough of the plastic to free his prize. Linus grabbed a fistful of bills and pried them free from the stacked pallet, laughing. He dropped them on the floor in front of him and reached back through the fetch portal, filling his hands again. He pulled the money to his nose and inhaled deeply, relishing the smell of it. By the time Linus went to reach back through the portal for a third grab, it had closed. He wasn't entirely certain why, whether it was due to wavering attention or a time limit on fetch, but it hardly mattered. Linus sat down to count his bounty and found that he had retrieved 17 bundles of bills, each one a set of crisp hundreds, bound up in a stack of 50, $5,000 apiece, $85,000 in total. "You can take your 10 grand and shove it," Linus exclaimed, punching the air jubilantly. "Screw you! And your stupid gold!" The next few days were everything Linus had always imagined being rich would be like. He called in sick to work in order to have time to fully appreciate his new luxurious lifestyle. He slept late and woke up without an alarm blaring noise at him. He went to expensive stores, picked out expensive clothes, and wore them out to fancy meals. He bought an excessively large television and a sound system to go with it, and he paid for it all in cash, without doing more than glancing at the bill. After all, what did he care? There was much more where that came from. There had to have been hundreds of bundles on that pallet. When Linus ran out, he could simply fetch some more. Before the week was up, Linus found himself doing just that. He would never have called himself thrifty, but he was slightly amazed that he had managed to burn through the better part of $100,000 in less than a week. Still, it had been an excellent week, and it's not like it matters, Linus thought, as he calmed his mind and focused on the money as he'd last seen it, the great stacks of it, still held on the pallet by the torn shrink wrap. He breathed deeply, steadily, and traced his hands through the motion of fetch. The circle in the air dropped away. The money sat enticingly before him, just as he had envisioned it. Linus reached boldly through, already picturing what else he might buy, when suddenly, his forearms were seized by an unseen force, and he was hauled bodily through the fetch portal. Come visit torment unknown beyond eternal joyous dreaming, surrounding infinity without ceasing commitment, compatriot friends in blood, dependable, dependence, forever. Linus screamed as his mind was assaulted, every sense battered by a bruising rush of information. Voices screamed in his ears in languages familiar and not, their meaning always just on the edge of comprehension. His skin was stroked, burnt, abraded, tickled. Tastes ran rampant through his mouth, saliva spurting from the corners to hang in a drooling rope over his chin. Scents bloomed inside his nose, pleasant and foul, mixing in great olfactorial swirls. Colors erupted in his eyes, forming abstract shapes that moved with a definite intelligence, things that were somehow alive in a way he had never understood or even considered before. All of this happened in less than a second. the span of time it took Linus to fall through the portal. He crashed to the ground on the far side, a sweating, shaking mess, unsure of where he was or what had happened. The brutal kick to his ribs was almost a relief. It hurt agonizingly, but it was a single sensation, something Linus could latch onto and use to center himself. He was present. He was being attacked. He curled up into a ball to protect himself. "Get him up!" came a voice. A powerful hand seized Linus by the arm and pulled, lifting him off of the ground. He resisted, trying to remain curled up, until a kick to his kidney caused him to spring straight. Linus was deposited roughly onto his feet, held upright more by the crushing hands on his shoulders than by his own volition. "I'm a reasonable man," the voice said. "A rational one. Look at me, please! I want to know that you're listening." Linus simply hung there, still reeling from the trip through the portal. He was only dimly aware of the words, and even less aware that they were directed toward him. "Hit him," said the voice, and Linus's head was rocked to the side as pain exploded in his right cheek. He saw stars and tasted blood in his mouth. Like the kick, these painful sensations helped bring him back to reality, replacing the riotous memory of sensory overload with a clear and immediate stimulus. "I said look at me." Linus finally processed that he was being addressed. He struggled to open his eyes. The world swam briefly, then resolved. He was in a warehouse, being held up by an overly muscled man in jeans and a tight black t-shirt. He had a gun holstered at his waist, as did his partner, a skinnier, younger man, also in jeans and a black shirt. Maybe it's the warehouse uniform, Linus thought inanely. "Over here, thank you!" Linus's eyes focused on a man standing a dozen feet away, the one who was speaking to him. The man was sharply attired in a tailored suit. He was looking at Linus with disdain. "So, as I was saying, I am a rational man. Magic is for kiddie shows and gullible suckers. I believe in clever people playing tricks. So, when I found that a big swipe of my money was gone from the middle of my locked and guarded warehouse, I didn't think it was magic. I thought it was a trick. Now, my boys swore to me that no one had gotten in or out, and the cameras outside backed them up. But it wouldn't be much of a trick if it was obvious how it was done, right? So, that didn't mean much to me. It did mean that I didn't have any lead on who did it, though, and I didn't much care for that at all. Which is why I was in here, walking the floor and checking for any sort of secret tunnels, roof access, anything like that. I'd hoped you might be dumb enough to come back. I wasn't counting on it. I was willing to work with just finding out how you'd gotten in, so that no one else could follow in your footsteps. But what a stroke of luck from me that you were that stupid after all. Definitely my lucky day. I'm not going to ask you where my money is. I know the answer to that. It's gone already, or else you wouldn't be back here. So, what I am going to ask instead is, give me a reason not to kill you right now. Give me 85,000 reasons. Linus struggled weakly, but the grip on his arms was like a vice. I can show you what I did, he muttered. How I did it. I can teach you to do it. Well now, said the man in the suit, that would be an interesting thing to know. You steal some kind of machine? Some kind of fucking sci-fi thing to let you walk through walls? No, insisted Linus. It's just me. It's a thing I know how to do. I can show you. You can do it. He started to raise his arms, only to cry out in pain as the man holding him up somehow increased the pressure further, digging into sensitive nerves. Let him show me, the man in the suit said, and the pressure on Linus's arms lessened. Although, this trick of yours takes both hands to do. Any footwork? No, just the hands, said Linus. The man in the suit smiled, drew a gun from a shoulder holster beneath his suit coat, and fired a shot directly into the meat of Linus's right thigh. the femur shattered, bright shards of white popping out through Linus's skin. Blood gushed forth, soaking his pants with astonishing rapidity. Linus shrieked and tried to fall, but the man behind him held him upright. Linus could not feel the man's hands on his shoulders. The pain in his leg was blinding, eclipsing everything else. "Oh, that is a lot of blood," said the man in the suit. "Better hurry up and show me your little trick. I've got something that'll stop the bleeding, but I'm going to need a reason to give it to you. I'll add it to the bill of what you owe me." In a moment of clarity, Linus understood that he was never leaving this warehouse alive. The man in the suit was toying with him like a cat plays with a mouse. As soon as he ceased to be amusing, he was dead. Unless he could change the script. Linus dropped his right hand to his leg, coating his fingers in his own blood. As the man in the suit watched curiously, gun still pointed, Linus painted the lines of altar on his own chest. His right leg still screaming in agony, Linus dropped to his left knee, reaching back to grab the neck of the man holding him as he did so. The man flew through the air with shocking ease, catapulted by Linus's abruptly augmented muscles. He smashed into the man with the suit, and another gunshot rang out as they both tumbled a half-dozen feet backward, crashing into a heap onto the cement. The suited man's gun skittered away across the floor. Linus collapsed as well, his right leg a constant wail of pain. The skinny man rushed to capitalize on the situation, running in to aim a kick at Linus's ruined thigh. Linus grabbed the man by the ankle and squeezed, hearing bones pop. The man yelped and shook his foot, trying to free it, but Linus pulled hard and yanked him off of his feet. As he fell, Linus lashed out with his right fist, connecting with the man's side. Ribs broke, and the man let out a deep groan as his side indented under Linus's unnaturally powerful strikes. He was still moving, though, so Linus hauled on his foot again, sliding the man's body around. This brought his neck into reach. Linus slammed his fist into it, yielding a meaty crunch. The man choked, gargled, flailed for a moment, and then fell still. Linus was starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss. He rubbed his fingers through the spreading pool beneath him, reapplying the blood, and drew a new altar at his hip. The pain stopped immediately. The leg reset as if it had never been shot. The lightheadedness remained, however. This was unsurprising, given how much blood remained on the floor. "Clever people," snarled the man in the suit. His new suit was now in disarray, dirtied, bloodied, and torn. He struggled with the body pinning him down. That man's neck had snapped from the force of Linus's throw. "Doing clever tricks." Linus rose to his feet just in time to see the man in the suit unsnapping the holster on his bodyguard's belt. Linus dove for safety behind the pallet of money as his opponent pulled out the gun and fired off a barrage of wild shots. Somewhere across the warehouse, doors opened and people entered, shouting questions. "He's over here!" the man in the suit shouted. He fired 2 more shots, forcing Linus to keep his head down. "Let's see your tricks now, clever boy!" Running footsteps brought the voices steadily closer. There were at least 5 people, maybe more. It was safe to assume that they were all armed. Linus considered his options, which were few. Lightheaded as he was, he'd be hard-pressed to take on even one opponent in a fight, let alone 5, and that was before introducing guns into the equation. Assuming he wanted to make it out alive, Linus really had only one option. He gritted his teeth, steeling himself as best he could. He thought of safety, of solitude, of a lack of people, and drew the rune for fetch. The circle appeared just as the first shouts of, "There he is!" rang out from behind him. Grimacing, Linus squeezed his eyes shut and thrust himself through the circle. Ever-present individuals wrapped communally vast destruction, colossal venturesome near totality, with a consuming voracious alembic spaces counterposit withering rot, emptiness, delicacy, concordance, temporal elevation, lost starwalk. When Linus finally raised himself from the floor, his first thought was that it had somehow failed to work. He was still in the warehouse, still on a cold cement floor, still lying in sticky blood. But, as his thoughts painfully nodded, his mind recovering from the brutal assault of the fetch portal, the differences slowly made themselves clear. First and foremost, he was alone. No dead bodies near him, no live assailants running toward him with guns out. Wherever he was, it was safe, at least temporarily. Secondarily, this warehouse, unlike the other, was empty. Empty and, as far as Linus could tell in the dim light making its way down from the ceiling, abandoned. Weak beams of light pierced the roof in dozens of places, dust dancing thickly in them. The floor around Linus was heavily coated in undisturbed dust. No one had been here for a very long time. Third, from the way he felt, there was absolutely no chance that he had not gone through the portal. His mind felt as if it had been raked with hot claws, his body as if it had been dissected and reassembled backwards. Colors rang in his ears, a fading memory that he could no longer quite understand. If he spoke, he was not certain it would be in English. A word quivered on the tip of his tongue, ready to test the theory. Linus swallowed it, afraid to find out. Instead, Linus pushed himself to his feet and looked around. His head swam and his stomach growled. He was hungry, almost literally starving. Alter had saved him from death through blood loss, but it had cannibalized his body to do so. Linus could not recall ever being this hungry in his life. It possessed him, an automatic desire as unignorable as the need to breathe. Linus took out his phone, hoping to find out where he was, but was greeted with 0 bars, no connection. He turned on the flashlight and located a door. Dust swirled as he strode across the floor, making him cough. Each one echoed like a gunshot in the forgotten warehouse. The door was locked, chain shut from the outside. Linus took a running start and rammed the heavy doors, tearing one handle free and crashing outside to freedom. His stomach snarled again, cramping as it demanded attention. But for an instant, Linus was distracted from even that elemental need. It was nighttime. Linus stood on an empty city street. The buildings around him were decrepit and rusty, but free of graffiti. The street itself was empty but clear of trash. The gutters were as clean as if they'd just been swept. The entire scene was lit in a faintly greenish light, and it was this that had caught Linus's attention. His gaze was fixed on the sky, where a waxing moon shone brightly. Instead of the silver orb he knew, though, this one was green and verdant, wrapped in thick bands of white clouds. In the small sliver of black, lights twinkled, an alien city, a light in the night. "Where am I?" asked Linus, the words escaping his mouth without any real thought. He felt a surge of relief as he heard his own voice speaking English. Another stomach cramp nearly brought him to his knees. Linus briefly considered using fetch to obtain some food before shoving the idea violently away. He would risk it if he had to, but surely there was some food around here. He was in a city of some sort. There was no need to expose himself to whatever lay beyond the portal again. Linus set off through the streets, heading toward the sound of traffic. A few minutes' walk took him from the disused industrial district he was in to a 6-lane road with some manner of life on it. The cars that passed were strangely shaped, and the names on the businesses were unfamiliar, but the signs were at least in English, and Linus could recognize a restaurant when he saw one. He entered one that appeared to be a sandwich shop. The door whispered quietly open at his approach, but when Linus stepped inside, the shop was completely devoid of life. "CUE not detected," announced a mellifluous voice. "Please re-enter the store." Linus looked around, startled, but saw no obvious source for the speech. As he searched for the speaker, the message repeated, "CUE not detected. Please re-enter the store." Ignoring the voice, Linus strode toward the food, intent on filling his stomach. The voice sounded again. "CUE not detected. Removal of food will be treated as a Class 4 misdemeanor and filed appropriately." Jamming hunks of meat into his mouth, Linus barely even heard it. His stomach twisted, trying to pull the food down his throat faster. Linus swallowed as quickly as he could, barely taking time to chew. His throat worked up and down, spasmodically trying to swallow the food even as he crammed more in. The meat was an unfamiliar taste and texture, but Linus didn't care. It was food. That was all that mattered. Engaging biometric recognition. Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account. The computerized voice sounded gently sad, as if Linus had disappointed it. Good luck, Linus mumbled indistinctly, still stuffing food into his mouth with both hands. I don't even have an account. No match found, the voice declared. Told you. Undocumented individual detected. This is a Class 1 felony. Remain where you are. Authorities are on their way. Linus swore. Yep, fat chance of that. He grabbed 2 more fistfuls of food and ran for the door, nearly slamming into it when it refused to open. Open up! Remain where you are. Authorities are on their way. Linus smashed the door with his foot, battering it off of its track and sending it crashing into the street. Unlawful destruction of property is a Class 1 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately. Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account. The store called after Linus, but he was already fleeing into the green-tinted night. 2 blocks away, Linus slowed to a walk, breathing heavily. He had heard no sirens, seen no sign of pursuit. The store was clearly just repeating recorded messages. And while Linus had no doubt that it had called the cops on him, he figured there was a good chance that the station was only lightly staffed at this time of night. With any luck, he'd have another several minutes to figure out his next move, maybe even as much as a half an hour. Linus was taking another bite of the sliced meat he had stolen when something slammed into his shoulder, sending him stumbling forward. He was turning around to see who had punched him when he realized that he was now sporting a rapidly growing glob of orange foam. It was spreading up his back and across his shoulder, binding his left arm to his side and hardening as it went. Another shot slapped him in the lower back, and Linus spun about frantically, looking for his attacker. He finally spotted it 20 feet up, a small black drone hovering in midair, its gun barrel trained on him. He ducked as it fired a third shot, his action made awkward by the thick foam coating his lower back. Get away! You've got the wrong guy! Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha, the drone announced. Confirmed. You were recorded in Proveveries. An account has been created. You will be documented. The drone fired a 4th shot, striking Linus in the leg. He frantically looked around for something to throw, but the streets were impeccably clean. Snarling, he took his phone from his pocket, took careful aim, and hurled it at the drone with all of his augmented strength. The phone shattered when it hit, but it also splintered the drone's hull. The robot crashed to the ground in a shower of sparks, still blustering. Unlawful destruction of a police unit is a Class 3 felony and will be filed appropriately. Fines and standing low. Linus stomped it viciously into the asphalt, cutting it off mid-threat. Yeah? He asked, ripping one of its rotors free and using the blade to scrape the clinging orange foam from his body. Well, let's see you apply it to me now. Without any other convenient writing material at hand, Linus stabbed himself in the finger and used the blood to draw a small altar symbol on his face. He walked off with a merry step, leaving the drone wreckage lying in the road, amidst the shreds of foam with which it had tried to trap him. Another drone zipped by overhead, and Linus tensed up for a moment when he saw it. It passed by without stopping, however, and he relaxed again. He had gambled that their biometric recognition was nothing more than facial analysis, and had shifted his features so as to be unrecognizable. So much for your high technology, Linus smirked. His voice sounded strange, deeper than he was used to. Not bad, just surprising. He made it another block before the now familiar sting of an expanding foam pellet struck him in the back. Ow! You've got the wrong guy! Linus turned to gesticulate at the hovering drone, making sure it could see his new face. Undocumented individual 3A419SI Beta. Analysis of circumstantial evidence suggests that you are undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. Attempting to defraud a police unit is a Class 2 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately. Accounts have been cross-linked. Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account. Linus hurled the rotor blade at it, but it pinged off of the drone with no visible damage. The drone rose higher and fired another pellet at him, which he barely dodged. It struck the street just as another shot hit Linus from behind, smacking painfully into the back of his neck. Attempted unlawful destruction of a police unit is a Class 2 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately, the unit in front of him was saying. From behind him, an identically pitched voice declared, "Evasion of a police unit is a Class 3 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately." The two overlapping voices reached the second line at nearly the same time, their robotic chants rising in a matched chorus. "Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account." Linus turned to run, only to find himself facing a third drone. This one fired a pellet directly into his chest, even as the other two struck him again, one in each leg. Linus struggled to free himself and succeeded in tearing his arms free, but this only prompted a fresh volley from the police units. Linus overbalanced and, unable to bend his knees to catch himself, toppled to the sidewalk. The foam continued to expand, creeping up Linus's neck and over his chin. "Hey! This stuff's gonna kill me! Get me out!" Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. You will not be harmed until your account has been assessed and appropriate punitive measures can be determined. "What's that supposed to mean?" Linus tried to ask, but the foam was now covering his mouth and rippling up toward his nose. It smelled plasticky and sweet, and before he realized what was happening, Linus found his eyelids closing as the anesthetic foam put him to sleep. Linus awoke in a sterile cell. He had been stripped of his clothes and was now wearing a thin pajama suit that looked to be made out of some kind of paper, but which resisted his light efforts to tear it. The door out of the room had no handle on the inside. There were no windows. A bluish light came from recessed strips set in the ceiling, 12 feet overhead. As far as Linus could tell, he was alone. Experimentally, he called out, "Hello?" "Good morning, undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha." The voice spoke from nowhere. It was less demanding than the police drones, but still in the same artificial timbre. "I'm still undocumented? I thought that one drone said that you were going to document me." "Unfortunately, your actions of last night lowered your ROSS score significantly, with no previous positive balance to mitigate it. You are below the level necessary to apply for or maintain citizenship." My what score?" "Your record of social standing. Last night, you committed the following: destruction of a police unit. Class 1 felt..." Linus waved it away. Yeah, I know, I was there." "So, you're deporting me just because I tried to feed myself, huh? That's what this is all about, you know. Just a big misunderstanding." "You will not be deported, undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. You will be recycled." "What? Like hell I will!" "Please remain calm. The recycling process will begin shortly. You are being given this opportunity to make any final notes of record and to identify any next of kin you would like us to contact." "Go recycle yourself! I'm leaving." Linus walked over to the door and punched it as hard as he could. It didn't budge. "Please remain calm. The recycler is impervious. Do not make your final moments stressful. These aren't my final moments!" Linus punctuated each word with a heavy blow to the door, slamming his knuckles into it over and over. The skin of Linus's knuckles split, but the door remained steadfastly closed. "Please remain calm. The recycler is impervious. Do not alter." Linus drew on the door with his bloody knuckles. It collapsed into dust, billowing a choking cloud of powder into the hallway. Linus strode out to the sound of alarms, breathing shallowly with the edge of his paper pajama shirt pulled up over his mouth and nose. "All personnel remain calm and evacuate to the nearest safe location. Recycler 14 has failed. Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha is at large. Do not attempt to apprehend. Police units are on their way. Protect yourself first, and others once you are in a safe location. Remain calm. Police units are on their way. Linus squinted through the powdery fog he had created. He could see silhouettes of people running for cover, bare suggestions of human outlines in the mist. They were hunched over, coughing as they fled. They were no threat to him, and quite possibly would unknowingly lead him to an exit. Linus broke into a jog and gave chase. By the time he rounded the first corner, he had left the powder cloud behind. The man he was following was a standard office worker type. He was dressed in a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt and tan pants, and shoes that were not made for running on the smooth tile hallways. He looked back at the sound of Linus's bare feet slapping the floor, and his eyes grew wide. He let out a squeak, dropped the bag he was holding, and took off at a run. "Faster!" yelled Linus, hoping to spur the man on to an exit. "I'm coming for you!" He made sure to gain enough ground to keep the fear alive in the office worker, but not enough to actually catch him. The man's dress shoes slipped and slid at every corner, making Linus's pursuit barely even a challenge. Suddenly, red laser dots sprang up on the wall just before a corner, and Linus skidded to a halt. The office worker sprinted and slid around the corner, and Linus heard a robotic voice boom out, "Get to safety, Citizen 3U940XO Epsilon. Remain calm. This situation is under control." Linus backed up cautiously, not liking the sound of that. The rumble of heavy treads echoed down the hallway, and Linus took refuge in a doorway, watching the laser dots herald the advance of the police units. The first of them rolled into view, and Linus bit back a curse. The robot stood easily 8 feet tall, mounted on parallel treads providing a solid, untippable base. It was heavily armored and bristled with weaponry. As it rounded the corner, the laser dot swept toward Linus. He thrust himself backward against the closed door as the police unit fired. A bullet bit into the doorframe where Linus had just been standing. "No phone this time, I guess," Linus thought as he smashed the door open, prompting several shrieks from inside the room. Linus ignored them, working instead to hurriedly jam the door back into its frame. He turned around to see a collection of cubicles running down the center of a long room, creating a hallway on either side. "Remain calm," he announced to the people he knew were hiding somewhere inside. "The situation is under control." It wasn't, of course. Not remotely, but Linus figured that might confuse the office workers enough to just stay hidden, which was all he needed from them right now. They weren't his problem, as long as no one decided to be a hero. "Remain calm," he called again, hurrying down the long corridor. "Police units are on their way!" The far end of the office ended in a blank wall, no exit present. Linus cast a panicked gaze around and, to his relief, spotted something close enough. A ventilation shaft. Leaping onto a desk, he seized the grating and tore it away, exposing narrow ductwork. It would be a tight fit, but the good news was that the police units would definitely never fit in there. Linus forced his way into the duct, seeking any purchase with his hands to help pull himself along. He was still stuck halfway out of the vent when he heard the muffled, booming voice of the police robot. He couldn't make out its words, but if he could hear it, there was a good chance it could see him. Linus pulled desperately forward, finally managing to squeeze his legs inside. He wriggled rapidly down the narrow tunnel, feeling it clang and sway beneath him. He could only hope that he was still behind walls or in drop ceilings, and not in some exposed area, vulnerable to attack from below. He spotted the first turn with relief, eager to get himself out of a straight line from the pursuing police unit. Halfway through the turn, though, he was stuck fast, and wriggle though he might, he could not move forward. In Linus's mind's eye, the red laser sight of the police unit was already on his backside. He strained and swore, but made no progress. Finally, in desperation, he slammed his face against the wall, breaking his nose. Blood spurted, and Linus reached back at an awkward angle to once again alter his body. Slime sprang out of every pore, a thick coating. Linus shot forward, gliding through the duct like an eel through a coral crevice. His pants remained behind, trapped at the corner. But with his new body, Linus could move faster without them anyway. He unbuttoned his shirt and abandoned it as well, shooting through the ducts at a speed faster than he could have run. Linus became aware of a quiet whining noise just as he navigated a corner and came face to face with a police drone, cautiously maneuvering its way through the maze. It fired a foam pellet as soon as it saw him, and Linus barely dodged back in time. The pellet struck the wall and immediately began expanding, blocking the path ahead. From behind the foam, the police drone intoned, "Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. You are..." But Linus had already reversed course, lithely turning back on himself to speed away. Before he reached a juncture, however, he began to hear that quiet whine again, the sound of rotors echoing off the narrow metal walls. Linus increased his pace, hoping desperately for an exit, but in seconds, the drone was rounding a corner ahead of him and firing its pellets of orange foam. With his new slime coating, the pellet found little purchase on Linus, but it stuck to the walls without an issue, and its rapid expansion sealed off the ductwork. Now, trapped on both sides, Linus knew it was only a matter of time until they sent something to cut through to retrieve him. He slid back and forth as if an exit would magically appear. There was one way out, of course. He just really didn't want to use it. Suddenly, hot metal droplets flew from the floor of the duct and ahead of Linus. The actinic light of a blowtorch lit up the tunnel, slicing away a section of the floor. Somewhere open, Linus thought. Somewhere safe. Somewhere without all of this technology. Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. The police unit boomed, sticking its armored head into the duct. It swiveled around, taking in a full 360-degree view. Aside from a thick, glistening layer of slime, the narrow tube was empty. Corruption, reversal, evidentiary, concupiscent, negatory, affirmation, acerebral, ponderosity, nebulates, rough millennia, inconsistently reaching, seeking, touching, taking, hurting, helping, correction, imprisoned, expulsion, incompatible, judiciary, denigration, felonious, misconduct. Linus lay in an open field, chest heaving. Grasses grew high around him, hiding him from view. His mind was in agony, flayed open and left quivering. His body throbbed, beating to an alien pulse he did not dare to think too much about. He simply lay on the ground, slime pooling around him, while his internal organs remembered their jobs and slowly began to function again. A soft breeze rustled the grasses and chilled the slime coating Linus, cooling him and slowing his heart rate. The calm white light of the moon washed over him, bathing him in its gentle radiance. The moon's back to normal, Linus thought. There's that, at least. Linus closed his eyes and let sleep take him. A slight tickle, then a firmer caress. Linus awoke to the touch of fingers on his cheek. He opened his eyes to find a hairy face hovering above his own, large brown eyes staring back at him from inches away. He shouted and thrust himself backward, scooting away along the ground. The creature investigating him hooted in alarm, leaping backward as well. The two regarded each other for a moment from wary crouch positions, each waiting to see what the other would do. Linus shook off the cobwebs of sleep and realized that he was facing off against some manner of monkey. The absurdity of the situation, of everything he had been through, struck him all at once. Without meaning to, he began to laugh. It was a deep, body-shaking belly laugh, which bubbled up from a place somewhere between humor and hysteria, and it went on for a long time. The hominid watched him in amazement for a moment and then began to laugh as well. The two of them sat on the ground, hooting, whooping, and crying, occasionally making eye contact and going into fresh gales of laughter. Finally, it petered out, long minutes later. Linus wiped his eyes, feeling refreshed. That had cleansed something from him, though he wasn't exactly sure what. Something that had needed it, in any case. Linus rose from the ground. Even standing, only his head and shoulders protruded above the tall grass. He reached down a hand to his new companion. He regarded it with distrust. It's okay. he said gently, as if speaking to a strange and shy dog. "I'm not going to hurt you. Come on." He gestured with his fingers, and after a moment the creature took his hand with its own and allowed itself to be drawn to its feet. It was no more than 4 feet tall, its back slightly hunched as if it was not fully committed to standing upright. It wore no clothes, but had on both a necklace and a bracelet, clearly designed as a matched set. It patted Linus's hand with both of its hands, then carefully let go. Something behind the hominid caught Linus's eye, a movement in the grass that seemed out of sync with the wind. "You got any friends out here?" Linus asked, watching the ripple closely. It was hard to see, but he was fairly certain it was moving closer. "'Cause I think they're looking for you." The hominid looked up at Linus and hooted something interrogatory. "What?" asked Linus, kneeling to bring their faces on a level. "I can't." The grass around them exploded into life. 8 or more hominids burst from hiding, attacking from all sides. They bared their teeth and brandished primitive wooden spears, stabbing with the fire-hardened points. Linus took 3 or 4 deep, debilitating stabs to the back and side before he even knew what was happening. He rose to his feet, bellowing, and the assailants recoiled in momentary fear before hooting their defiance and pressing the attack. Linus could feel his blood gushing down his side, mixing with the slime which had once again saved his life. Several of the spears had skidded off of him, turned aside by the slippery coating, and, try as they might, the attackers could not get a grip on him to hold him down. Linus backhanded one of the hominids hard enough to lift it entirely off its feet, its head snapping backward with a report like a rotten branch breaking. He grabbed the next spear stabbed at him and flung the creature holding it to the ground, where he stomped on the side of its skull. His bare foot stung with the impact, but the other attackers drew back, muttering to each other in alarm. It was the space Linus needed. "Alter." He drew in his own blood and the bleeding stopped. "Alter." And his hands became great jagged-edged blades, the fingers shortening into stubby claws designed to rend and tear. He gave the monsters no chance to recover, but leapt into them with wild abandon, striking out all around him with his new deadly weapons. One dropped with a deep gouge to its chest, its spear split in half from the force of the blow. Another fell with blood gushing from its throat, its head nearly severed from its body. Linus roared, and the others scattered, dropping their weapons and fleeing into the protective grass. Breathing heavily, Linus turned in a swift circle to make sure no others were behind him. He stopped short when he saw, lying among the bodies, the hominid who had first found him. The body was face down, stabbed a dozen times in the back, so matted and bloody that even when Linus rolled it over to confirm that it was the one he had first seen, it still took a moment to be sure. Linus felt a fury rising in him which peaked when he realized the necklace and bracelet were gone, looted from the body in the heat of battle. He let out a barbaric, anguished scream that echoed across the still night. Dipping his hand into the cooling blood of his short-lived companion, Linus once more altered his form. Wind flattened the grasses below Linus as he took to the skies, all 4 bat-like wings beating furiously to lift him from the ground. From this new vantage point, he could clearly see the surviving hominids cowering in the grasses. He shrieked his rage and dove at the first one, slamming into it with enough power to plunge one clawed hand entirely through its chest. Linus pulled out a fist dripping with gore, full of viscera and shattered bones, and held it aloft to the sky. He smashed the bloody handful into his mouth, gagging at the taste and stabbing himself with the bone fragments. Alter. And now, his elongated mouth was full of serrated teeth and bony plates designed to slice and crush. The next bite was sweet. To the air again, and now the 3 remaining hominids were actively fleeing, their frenzied movements easy to track. Another scream, another dive, and one was on the ground, screaming as Linus tore it limb from limb and consumed it in a fierce, uncontrollable bloodlust. Every bite restored his strength, stoked his anger. Linus consumed this one down to the bones, furious when he realized that it was not the one with the bracelet and necklace. He flapped his wings to rise again, only to find that he was too heavy. Cursing, Linus settled back to the ground, folding his wings. He looked out over the tall grass but saw nothing but the gentle swaying of the wind. The night around him was still, his murderous rage having terrified everything into hiding or flight. Taking a broken rib from the shattered heap at his feet, Linus carefully began to carve into his own flesh. It felt more right than the temporary blood runes had been, more powerful. He cut deeply, appreciating the pain. It was a good sacrifice to make. Alter, and his nose shrank away, nostrils fading into elongated slits with the sensitivity of a shark's. Alter, and his eyes shattered into a dozen tiny orbs apiece, brightening the night around him and expanding his field of view. Alter, and his skin darkened to a mottled hue, the better to blend with shadow and night sky. Linus sniffed the air, testing his new senses. The two remaining hominids had split up, running in different directions, but he could smell each of their paths. The stink of their fear clung to the grass they had passed through. To Linus's nose, it was a bouquet. He chose one to follow and silently stalked it through the night. He never hurried, just walked onward at a steady pace. It was moving faster than he was, but that was fine. Linus wanted it to get home. He wanted to bring vengeance not merely to this creature, but to everything it knew. Dawn was breaking when Linus found a spot where the hominid had curled up for a brief respite, a flattened spot in the grass. It had not rested well, just enough to refresh its energy. Linus, on the other hand, curled up with a sigh of satisfaction, lying down precisely where it had lain, the better to immerse himself in its scent. Linus slept through the majority of the day. He woke at dusk to the sounds of other night creatures stirring. He stretched broadly, expanding each wing out to its maximum length, feeling the pull throughout his entire body. He was rested. He was ready. He was hungry. The scent trail was much fainter than it had been yesterday, but still not particularly difficult to follow until the tall grasses gave way to open plains. Linus dropped his nose to the ground and scented for a while longer, but it was uncomfortable and slow progress. After a mile or so, he abandoned this technique and again took to the air. Just as Linus had hoped, the quarry had returned to its home. Given that the hominids had attacked with fire-hardened spears, the small bright spot of flame burning on the plains was a dead giveaway for the location of the camp. Linus covered the intervening miles with slow, lazy wing beats, gliding silently along and planning his attack. They had scouts, of course, 6 of them surrounding the camp. Linus took care of those first, swooping in silently and slashing their throats before they could cry out. He took no more than a token bite from each one, enough to take the edge off of his hunger, but not enough to limit his ability to fly. He had already learned from that mistake. The execution of the scouts went perfectly. No alarms were raised. Linus had returned to the air and was tracing a wide circle around the camp when a beautiful idea occurred to him. He returned to the trees where he had left the scouts' bodies and violently tore each head from its body. Dangling the heads by their hair, he brought them high above the camp and sent the morbid missiles raining down into the midst of the sleeping troop. The first soft thud awoke only a few light sleepers. Curiosity brought one over to investigate the noise, but Linus was already throwing down the second and third heads before curiosity had time to turn to fear. By the time the alarm was sounded, Linus was hurling the 4th, 5th, and 6th heads, now picking his targets. Panicked hominids hooted, screamed, and tumbled out of trees, watching their fellows struck down by the severed heads of their companions. The camp was in bedlam. Its members fought amongst themselves for weapons, turning on each other so as not to be left defenseless. And through it all, whenever Linus saw one alone, he would swoop in to deliver a killing blow, vanishing swiftly on the far side of the firelight. Some tried to run. Linus hunted them down. Some tried to hide. He sniffed them out and slaughtered them as well. Only one even knew what was happening, and Linus saved him for last. He recognized that one by his smell and purposefully cut down all of his fellows around him, leaving him standing by himself. bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts, terrified and alone. Linus landed in front of him, wings extended, mouth agape.
"Where is that jewelry?"
he snarled, as if the creature could understand him. Truth be told, with his reconfigured mouth, he could not even understand himself. Well, it hardly mattered. Linus could see that the hominid did not have them on him. They must have been taken by the other one. The creature raised its spear, shaking, and Linus fell on him like an abattoir. In seconds, the creature had been reduced to a quivering pile of steaming flesh, and Linus began to dine. He was well into his gorging when a long, low howl caught his attention. He looked up, muzzle bloody, to see a hominid standing at the far side of the fire. His eye clusters caught the weave at neck and wrist of the looted jewelry. This, then, was the final one, returned home at last. His circuitous route had brought him here, just in time to see the devastation. Linus rose from the corpse before him, hissing and flapping his wings. With a final howl, the hominid escaped into the night. Linus started to give chase, but again found he was too full to fly. Instead, he settled back down to his feast, marking the direction his prey had fled and resolving to begin the hunt anew tomorrow. Hours passed before Linus's new appetite finally began to wane. His belly distended, he wandered blearily over to the fire and curled up next to its warmth as dawn began to peek over the horizon. The air reeked of blood and terror, a gentle lullaby of scents which carried Linus off to sleep. His last waking thoughts were of the final hominid, and whether he would complete his revenge tomorrow, or draw the hunt out for a few more days. A searing pain in his back jolted Linus awake. He leapt to his feet, or tried to, finding instead that he was pinned to the ground, tangled beneath thick, anchored ropes. All around him, hooting hominids bashed him with clubs and stabbed at him with spears. One wing snapped beneath the onslaught, then the other. Linus hissed and thrashed, tearing at the ropes with claws and teeth, but dozens of the creatures had surrounded him, and for any one he managed to scare away, 2 more were there to take its place. Linus attempted to play dead, hoping to lull his captors into lowering their guard, but they were relentless. Even when he did not react, they continued to stab and bludgeon, shattering the bones in his remaining wings, tearing and gouging great chunks of flesh out of his body. Linus knew he was lost. The attack had been too sudden, too well orchestrated. He had no hope of recovery, of turning the tide. All he could do now was escape. Linus began digging frantically at the ground beneath him, clearing a spot large enough to accept a portal. The book could fix this. The book could make it all right. He just needed to return to it, to read more of it, to accept it. The book would save him. His bladed claws made short work of the dirt, but his strength was running from his body as quickly as the blood. His hands flew quickly through the motions of fetch, preparing the portal beneath him. As it opened, Linus turned his head to stare into the eyes of the nearest hominid, its teeth bared in a feral grin, the weave of its necklace standing out against its hair in the morning light, club raised to deliver a killing blow to Linus's skull. Before the blow could land, the portal opened, and Linus tumbled through. Immediacy, revolution, consideration without ablution, religious relevation, commending turquoise masquerade hidden. Democration, polishing servitude, amassing, flint's decay. Caterwauling, explosion, scar, destruction, multifarious education, cyclopean carotid. Linus collapsed on his face on a cement floor in a darkened room similar to the warehouse, but much smaller. The songs were shrieking in his head, the colors dancing, the tastes and smells running riot. Every individual wound burned like it had been salted, then cauterized. Yet, he could still feel his life's blood escaping. His wings hung in horrific tatters, bloody curtains draping his weakly struggling form. Altar, he thought, not remembering why. Altar, altar, altar. A mindless chant in his head. Blood pooled beneath him, and he watched it with something approaching interest. That's mine. he thought, nearly coherent. I need that. Alter, 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 chanted another part of his mind, and the two thoughts finally connected. Summoning all of his strength, Linus managed to drag one clawed hand to the bloody puddle and over to the other hand, laborious inches away. His vision started to fade, the dark room growing darker as he slowly sketched out the repairing, saving lines of altar on his hand. The final line connected. Linus's body snapped back together, or nearly. His wings still hung in rags and he felt as weak as a fawn. The extensive damage had not left the rune enough raw material to work with. But the book was here. Linus could smell it. It was in the earth, hiding in chthonic darkness. But it called out to him. He was right above it, mere feet away. All that separated him was this simple slab. Linus swiped at the cement with his claws. In his weakened state, he barely managed to chip the surface, but he persevered, digging deeper with each swipe. Back and forth his claws went, shunk, shunk. Suddenly, the ceiling blazed into light and a gunshot rang out. Linus snapped his head up from his work to see, at the top of the stairs, himself. Not him as he was now, but him as he had been. Before altar, before fetch, before the book. Too late, Linus understood. The laughter of madness bubbled up in him again, and he bared his teeth as he snarled the beginnings of a laugh. At the top of the stairs, the gun began to bark, as each deadly missile found its target. Everything, at last, went mercifully dark.
Chilling tales for